Okay, I'm going to call the meeting to order. I know we always seem to have some little glitches happening with technology, but I think we can probably get through some of the early portions of this as if people are still working on odds and ends. As we call the meeting to order, I just want to acknowledge that the land on which we're gathered and do our work is the traditional territories of the Coast and Strait Salish peoples. Specifically, we honor the Lekwungen people known today as the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations, whose long-standing connections to these lands and adjoining waters continues to this day. Our first order of business is just approval of the agenda for November 14th. Approved, moved, and seconded. All those in favor? Any opposed? Not opposed. That carries. We have adoption of minutes for October 23rd, 2 sets of minutes. Can I get a mover and a seconder to approve? Move and second. Changes, corrections, or amendments to those minutes? Seeing none, all those in favor? Any opposed? Not opposed. We have one rise and report. The Qantas Tea Room lease moved and seconded for the rise and report. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. I have pages sticking together, but that's not quite to 7 yet. Next up is Mayor's remarks. We have, I just want to point out, if anybody is online and wishes to address council on items not on the agenda tonight, but of interest to the community, you can do so by calling into the 1855 number and hitting *9 to raise your hand. Or if you're on the Zoom app, you can raise your hand, and at the end of my remarks, I'll turn to anybody who's indicated they wish to speak. My voice is going already, which is probably good news for short mayor's remarks, but I have a few things to say. It's been a while since we've met, so just a few little odds and ends. I just want to thank staff and council for the Trick or Treat on the Avenue. The Business Improvement Association put on an amazing thing, which is all them and not us, but council actually participated for the first time with the table out front, and had a large number, I think a couple of thousand kids come by, and it was quite a show there with all the adults and kids and dogs and everybody dressed up. I just want to thank Councillor Braithwaite for speaking on my behalf at the Ken Agate Memorial that happened on November 4th, to Councillor Patterson, who was able to attend on my behalf at the Tree Appreciation Day when I was out of town. The November 9th had Remembrance Day. Had the Night of Remembrance from the Canadian College of Performing Arts, which again, Councillor Patterson, her role as acting mayor, was able to say words. And there was also just on November 9th the Kristallnacht, which is put on by the Jewish community, and I think especially poignant and relevant this year, given the reemergence of so much anti-Semitism in the last month or so. Want to also congratulate Parks, Rec and Culture for another successful artist studio tour that happened on the weekend. These also our second of the International Tennis Federation, this time a senior tournament. Previously it was a junior tournament that completed here in Oak Bay. That's only our second ever, the ITF tournaments. We did attend the Victoria Regional Transit Commission meeting as one of the directors. And we are certainly in, with no other funding changes from other levels of government, in for a series of fairly substantial increases to costs. But there is, of course, a public input right now review of the fares for consideration. And so we certainly encourage the members of the public who have an interest to please participate in that feedback. I also want to just congratulate Colin Plant for his re-election as board chair of the Capital Regional District. Zach DeVries for his re-election as chair of the Capital Regional Housing Corporation, and of course I was re-elected as the chair of the Capital Regional Hospital District. So those happened last week, those elections. I just want to point out, and I'll touch on this in a bit more detail, on November 20th, that's next meeting, we're going to have a bit of a deep dive into some of the housing targets and New Homes for People's plan and impacts on some of our housing plans, and that'll form and lead into our November 27th strategic planning process as we evaluate our priorities for the coming 3 years. I do have a few more detailed pieces in that. I want to just recognize that today is also 1 year from the council swearing in. And so we sit here, and I want to just state I am excited about the opportunities for our community. I am proud to serve with this council and the skilled staff that we have, and I'm very pleased to see the progress we have made on some of the council's key priorities. I'll just highlight a few here, such as the First Nations reconciliation, advancing with the reconciliation guide in place. The engineering asset replacement team is largely built and starting the large-scale asset replacement projects. Planning department is fully or close to fully staffed for the first time in years, and is working on multiple projects to advance housing goals. We have our first 3 cycling corridors funded and or in detailed design for implementation phases. We started our playground replacements and more. There's a lot to be excited about. And of course, there are still many projects we wish were moving faster, which is why we have priorities coming up. I invite the public to come and witness our annual check-in on priorities at the end of this month as we look to refine and reprioritize our work. Before the priorities on the 27th, there will be that committee of the whole, which will examine the impacts of the various provincial housing initiatives and legislative changes on our land use initiatives, and I would encourage residents of Oak Bay to join us at that meeting to understand the framework and limitations that face us over the coming few years. Related to the provincial housing initiatives, I'd like to just spend a few minutes highlighting a bigger topic, which is just what I consider to be some concerns around risks to our democratic process at the municipal level. And I'm referring here to the, I think, well-intentioned legislative changes by the province related to housing, but that will have significant long-term impacts to our local government. Democracy is hard, it's inconvenient, but it's worth fighting for. It is fragile, it requires the trust of our residents to flourish. To protect it, we create structures that institutionalize transparency, accountability, and the rule of law, without which it can't survive. It's these structures I see as threatened with some of this new legislation. And we know we often take democracy for granted in Canada, but it's good to remember how hard it is to set up and maintain a healthy democracy like ours. You know, people all over the world, like places like Ukraine, are willing to fight and die for the opportunity just to live in a country that has equal rule of law and democracy. And on November 11th, just 3 days ago, we honored those that fought and died to protect our values and democratic ideals. I do think this is worth fighting for, and I think it's important that we structure our government in a way that encourages the strength of democracy. I want to just touch, for those who aren't too familiar with municipal government, because it's quite different from provincial and federal, because it's closer to the people that we serve, it's nonpartisan, and it's transparent and accountable by design. And that's what some of the examples of that is. First and foremost, I think the public is able to view the same information. They see the agendas, they see the information, the advice. It's all provided at the same time to the public and to council. When we have these meetings, the public can see all of the correspondence, the staff advice, and witness a full debate, which is quite unique in government. And in that respect, nothing happens behind closed doors. We're required to have these meetings in the public realm, and we in fact broadcast them and record them so people can watch them later, and record minutes so people can see the decisions that are made. Our accounting principles, where we can't run deficits and are forced to actually budget every year to meet our needs, helps create that transparency, and are required to comply with generally accepted accounting principles also lends itself to that transparency. Our public input is on almost all agenda items, and in fact, we also make time at every meeting for the public to talk to us about issues that aren't on our agenda, but might be of interest to them or to the community at large. We are required at this point to have equitable public input on land use decisions in a way that ensures maximum opportunity to find improvements and address concerns. That public hearing model is legislatively strict, and in fact has been thrown out many times with decisions if it hasn't been seen to be completely fair to everybody who's spoken. And last but certainly not least, councillors are required to have an open mind. So this is a very nonpartisan model. We are required to come into this chamber with an open mind and ready to listen, to consider points of view, and to make our decisions and be accountable for those decisions. That is intended to drive consensus or compromise where possible, and it's not always possible. And there's really good reasons for that approach at this level of government. We're often dealing with land use decisions or aspects of land use like infrastructure that last for 60, 70, 100 years. And it's important that all available information, every pro or con, every risk, every opportunity is considered before those decisions are made, because the time span of those decisions is so long. This model also ensures that all the decisions are based on the same information coming in. We're not having 7 people making decisions on 7 different facts. We're all required to have the same information as we make that decision. And that is good on principle on its own, but also it helps prevent any kind of unseen or secret influence on decision making. And it really helps clarify the differentiation between professional staff advice, advisory bodies that might have a pillar of knowledge or expertise, the general public, which may have historical or localized knowledge or general community concerns, and then the council, which has, of course, our own backgrounds and experiences that we were selected to sit at this table. And I think it's also just, I want to point out here, the structure is not accidental. It was put in place by provincial legislation. That's been there for many decades. And it was designed, I think, really from an idealized version. Almost sometimes I laugh at how much we have public input and structures of this sense, because they see it as important for making our decisions. And some of that is being changed pretty considerably with some of the proposed legislation. Notably, a year ago, as I said, this is our sort of 1-year anniversary of being sworn in. 161 municipalities went through an election. 161 municipalities had feedback to their councils, to their councillors, to the mayors as they were running. They listened to their electorate, and they were given a mandate to set a direction and a policy for their communities, to steward those communities going forward. And I just have to say that those residents' votes lose a lot of their meaning with the new legislation. Those visions and priorities set by the elected officials are really required to be set aside by the new legislation. Many of those pillars of transparency and accountability mentioned are also being set aside. And I know this is a crisis, and the existence of a crisis is often used to minimize or set aside democratic principles. But I think these are the times that we have to be very careful in terms of when those are changed. Because housing is indeed a crisis, both housing and affordable housing. So is climate change, climate adaptation, our healthcare crisis, our overdose epidemic, and many more. And while democratic approaches can slow those changes, and it is an inefficient system, I just disagree that there's this level of representative government, which I think is so well designed to be accountable, is being what I would call gutted, but certainly I would say damaged in the name of this crisis response. And I just point out here, local governments have been openly seeking partnership with the province for a long time. And while this housing crisis is partially the part of the responsibility of municipality, it is certainly not entirely the responsibility of municipalities. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, over the last couple of weeks, the BC provincial government released a series of legislative packages that require changes to zoning and oversight, which takes much of the power from elected officials to implement their land use priorities. It blocks the public from having a say in the future community. And we've gone overnight from welcoming or even legislatively requiring the inclusion of public knowledge into decision-making to blocking it. The legislation will also download all the costs of these changes in very short order for zoning, procedure bylaw, housing need reports, official community plan revisions, amenity cost charge bylaws, and other requirements, and many of which are still to be detailed. They're going to fall onto the municipalities and onto very stretched planning departments. I think we'll get to this next week, and next couple of weeks we go through priorities, but it will almost certainly require us to rejig some of our priorities as a community. And of course, what's being mandated is this sort of blanket rezoning of 4 to 6 times current level density. I think most importantly here, though, is that under the way the structure of this, the zoning is going to happen first, and then the OCP review, which is the only point public's allowed to talk to it, really puts the public input into this process a year behind the actual changes that are going to be happening. Therefore, removes the role of local planning in that process. And I just asked sort of why do we need to change and take away the powers and democratic accountability of this level of government because of the housing crisis? Why rescind these delegated authorities in this way without consultation? And I think part of it is the provinces, and I think unfortunately, and the federal government has to a certain degree as well, framed the issue as one where municipalities are the cause of all of the housing problems, and that the public input is just too messy and slow. It's that democracy is too messy and slow. And so this approach of standardizing zoning, it has positive and understandable intentions, and I think it probably is primarily intended to be more efficient. But I'm just going to make a couple of points here about the fact that we are willing partners in this, and I think it could be done without the dramatic impact. I think if you look at the 161 communities across the province, you'd probably find 161 of them would have housing reform as a priority. Most of them have infill housing projects underway. And in many cases, including us, those projects have been set aside for time being while we were waiting for provincial legislation. One of the biggest barriers that we've had, of course, is being the lack of pre-zoning. And I think that's a fair criticism of municipalities, that we've set OCPs and we've set guidelines, but we haven't set zones that actually comply with our guidelines. And that is something I think that we all need to work towards. I just want to point out here, though, again, in this sort of weird environment where it's like everybody's pointing fingers at municipalities, that structure was quite intentionally set up. So when municipalities are looking at new development, we asked for things like DCCs, or development cost charges or amenity cost charges, community amenity charges, they've changed it to ACCs, as ways of gathering some of the direct cost impacts of these developments to the municipalities, so to fund things like parks or infrastructure upgrades and so forth that are required from the increased density. the simplest way of applying those is through rezoning. And so for most municipalities, they've held on to old zoning and kept changed OCPs because it allowed for case-by-case rezoning so that we could trigger these cost charges. And that was, you probably saw in the paper, these concerns about the fact that if all of these blanket zoning goes through, that all those charges are going to be lost and the costs are no longer going to be carried by development. So they've addressed it, and I'm really appreciative of the province's response to that criticism to put forward a amenity cost charge model. I think it's a really good one. I think it'll create certainty for developers and for municipalities. But I just want to point out here, 2013, the Strong Fiscal Futures came out from UBCM asking for revisions to the DCC process. In 2021, asked again to please make changes to this. It can only be done through legislation at the provincial level. And those are being ignored by successive provincial governments. And this is not atypical. We've had a number of these sorts of things where UBCM has lobbied for increased investments in affordable housing and other priorities. And so I guess my point of this is we have a housing crisis. We have an affordable housing crisis, which is slightly different. But they're not entirely falling on the municipalities. And we would like to be partners in this going forward. The causes are complex. Certainly they're a combination of municipal, federal, and provincial policy over decades, and they're going to take some time and probably all three partners working together to fix. Any potential benefits that coming from these changes have to be weighed against other values, and those include this erosion of democracy, which is embedded in the legislation at the local government level, the removal of the public's right to participate in shaping the communities that they live in, this lost accountability for decision-making at the local government level, and a significant shift from accountable decision-making of local elected officials to industry-led changes as to where and when community makeup is going to change. I also just point out that issues like amenities, climate mitigation, climate adaptation, infrastructure, capacity, affordability, transportation, commercial center viability, public safety capacity, and many other factors are effectively sidelined in terms of priorities or consideration. We have they're to be considered in future, but not as part of any of this initial discussion on changes. And to my mind, this is a rollback of democratic principles. It certainly takes the ability of our councils to shape individual communities, to respond to local issues, and be accountable for those changes that are made. I believe we can address housing routine, the democratic good of municipal government by working together. I don't think this current model is the ideal one. I'm certainly hopeful that the province will look at some of the impacts of this and work with communities, and particularly UBCM, to look at some possible models here that we can still have some local control, still include accountability and public input at the local level to achieve the housing goals that are needed. Certainly it would be helpful to know what the housing goals are of the province at this point too, which we still don't exactly know. Thank you for listening. And thank you to all online for your interest in our community's future. I do remain hopeful the province will consider feedback on the proposed legislation and work with municipalities to make it the best it can be. Much longer mayor's remarks than I normally make, but it has been a few weeks and I think that had to be spoken to. We move next to public comment and question period, which is I ask if anybody online wishes to address council on issues of public interest. Not on the agenda. If there's items on the agenda that you wish to speak to, we'll have the opportunity at those times where they say they're available for public input. I didn't see any hands popping up while I was speaking, so I have a feeling our audience is low and there's no hot button issues that people wish to speak to. So with that, I'm going to turn to item number 7.1, which has been deferred to a future meeting. So 7.2 is our CRD Land Assembly Housing and Land Banking Service Establishment Bylaw. Mr. Coates, I believe you're providing a brief introduction.
Thank you, Your Worship, members of council. Yes, so the report before you was provided to sort of wrap the request from the Capital Regional District for your consideration toward the consent of the adoption of an amendment to the Land Assembly Housing and Land Banking Service Establishment Bylaw that essentially would increase the amount of annual debt repayment that would be authorized should this amendment proceed. And for that amendment to proceed, 2/3 of the participating municipalities would have to give the board their consent to the adoption of the bylaw. And as the report indicates, they're looking to increase the annual debt servicing capabilities from $5 million a year to $11.5 million a year. the CRD talks about the impacts of that being about $26 for the average household in the region. That's a difficult number to try to sort of massage to represent what that might mean to individuals in Oak Bay. But essentially, looking at the numbers, it's slightly more than double what's paid for that same service now if that authorization was to proceed. I am aware that there aren't any specific projects that have been identified at this time, but the CRD is working toward a number of projects in the future, and the consent right now would give them the authorization when those projects come forward for further consideration. And I'm happy to answer whatever questions I can in relation to this one.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mr. Coates, and I'll try and chip in my knowledge as well, as this has been at the CRD table for a while now. Came in two different guises, and this is the final version that came forward. Councillor Green?
Thank you, Mayor. I do have questions, but I'm not sure it's fair. I'm not sure Mr. Coates can answer them directly, and I'm not sure you can either. So they're sort of rhetorical questions, but they're questions that popped into my mind.
I'm just going to point out rhetorical questions are the easiest ones to answer.
Okay. Well, the first one is, and I'm reminded at the Forum of Councils recently, we heard from our First Nations communities in the region about their concern around land acquisitions, land use, and so on at the CRD level. So my first question is, in this process, have First Nations been consulted around this whole issue? That's the first question. Do you want me to ask them all and then?
I'll just try and answer that one. So
Okay,
there is a board policy to reach out and inform all the partner First Nations if there's any land acquisition underway. By its very nature, land acquisition asks tend to be private, so it depends on the nature of that piece. But that is actually a board policy now to try and include them on those things to see how they might be involved in any land acquisition. So to answer that question, but I think their primary concern is land disposition. So where a government is getting rid of land, then they're also they want an opportunity to have an understanding of an opportunity to purchase that land where it's possible.
Thank you. And just my comment to that is that informing is different than consulting. So just to keep that in mind, I hope the CRD will keep that in mind. Thank you. My second question is, do we know how this will impact the capacity of local governments to meet their housing targets vis-a-vis the new provincial legislation? So that, again, is a question that will probably require study. But if you wouldn't mind taking that to the board level, if appropriate at some point.
Sure. Well, just a couple of pieces here. So this is a follow-on. There was a Regional Housing First program that took all of the sort of various funding factors related to housing at the CRD, consolidated them and added to them to max out the available ask. That's the amount that was being asked for before. A total of about used that money to leverage borrowing and other pieces to fund $40 million. And then that partnership went with the province and the federal government to each also contribute $40 million. So there's $120 million in total that was used to build particularly Housing First, but actually across the board a number of housing units. So there was close to 2,000 units of housing built, of which about 240 were low barrier or affordable housing. And so the idea of this is to sort of continue that model of seeking a partnership with the federal and provincial government to leverage that to acquire affordable housing. So where those affordable housings are built, they would contribute to the numbers in those communities. A number of those are going to be likely taking down older buildings that maybe were just 1 or 2 stories, and they're going to be replacing them with higher density buildings. So it depends on where it is.
Okay, thank you. And my last question really is, property assessments are higher, and I think Mr. Coates touched on this briefly, are higher in Oak Bay on average. What are the anticipated actual long-term impacts? Under financial impact, they talk about actual impacts, so I'm just wondering if there's any idea about the long-term impacts. And it's difficult, and just a quick comment, it's difficult to approve something like this without knowing what the projects are. And I am fully supportive. I served on the Housing Corporation Board and on the RHTF myself, so I know how important these housing projects are at the CRD level. But these are just questions I'm asking on behalf of the community. Thank you.
Those are great questions. I'll do my first cut at it, and I'll maybe hand it back to Mr. Coates. It's an enabling bylaw, so what this approving this gives is the authority to where, say, needed $10 million for a project, they would then do a requisition for $1 million, say, to taxpayers to fund the borrowing for that $10 million. So it's an enabling bylaw that allows for more of seating up to this amount, and so the individual projects will come case by case. Those will be going to the CRD board for approval, not to this table for those approvals. So it's really that balance. And you're right, it's difficult to say, but this is setting the maximal amount that could be used, and the project will be selected at the CRD table. Mr. Coates, I'm not sure if you want to add to that.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think you did a great job explaining that. And again, I wish we were able to really sort of drill in and talk about what the implications might be to a typical Oak Bay property, but it's really difficult to sort of move that information around to come up with that, because it depends on, everything's based on funding next year as well, and we don't know what's happening with assessments across the region. But I think, generally speaking, the numbers that they talk about on the impacts per house is one thing. And I just wanted to elaborate quickly on something that the mayor had mentioned, and I was just at a meeting on Friday where the CAO of the CRD was talking about this particular bylaw on the authorization, and they really are sort of at the first part of this looking more at their existing housing units and the fact that they are sort of nearing end of life, and looking at, as the mayor indicated, sort of redoing those and adding density on existing properties. So it's more about building the homes than it is about acquiring land. And I did ask the question about was land acquisition part of that, because the service is aptly named for that purpose. And the answer to that was yes, but that generally they feel like they probably have a lot of projects around redoing these existing buildings, and again, adding much more, because they're typically more low density where there's opportunities to increase the density.
Thank you both.
Thanks, Councillor Graydon, Councillor Braithwaite, and Councillor Patterson.
Thank you so much. So my question is around by us agreeing to this, does it affect how much money we can borrow from the MFA, or what money is available to the rest of the region from the MFA?
Mr. Coates.
And I know I'd rather Mr. Payne answer that question, but I can tell you that, so the district is part of the CRD, but this is exclusive of the district's own borrowing authority, which is calculated on our own, sort of based on our own means, and so this is exclusive from that.
Okay, thank you, because I wasn't sure if there was a pool of money from the MFA that was inclusive of the whole of the CRD, and so, but you've answered that question. So in that case, my next question you probably answered as well, because my next question would be, would it affect our rating through the MFA? But from what you just said, then it won't, because it has nothing to do with us as an individual municipality.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, through you to Councillor Braithwaite. Yes, so I think that's right, is that it really doesn't affect what Oak Bay wants to do on its own, but Oak Bay is a member of the CRD, and there is some relationship there, but our ability to borrow money is calculated on our own sort of physical assets and means.
Thank you, Mr. Coates. I believe the number, and I might be wrong on this one, but I believe the number, you can borrow up to, there's a maximum 25% or something of the value, and I believe the CRD right now is sitting with the debt load at about 6%, so they're well within their allowable amount even. And so this would bump it up a little bit, but not considerably. Councillor Patterson?
Yes, thank you. And either for yourself, Mayor, or for Mr. Coates, I'm not sure who can best answer this. But I did notice, I've been trying to follow some of this through the CRD committees and the meetings they've been having, although there's a lot of meetings to watch. And I did notice that the cost per average household is scheduled to rise fairly significantly over a 10-year capital plan. Is that directly attributable to the increased funding that will be provided, or has it been ramping up from an existing base? What's causing that increase?
I'm pretty sure I'm the only one who can answer that question in this room at the moment. So there's no significant capital increases at the CRD. Every year there's a target set. This year is going to be 3.5% cumulative total amount, and that's divided up amongst the Housing Corporation, the CRD, and the Hospital District. Where that big knuckle is happening, I think maybe was the capital project was the Hospital District. So under the Hospital District Act, the hospital district is responsible for a percentage. Most jurisdictions it's 40%, and in our region it's 30%, but we also fund 30% of quite a number of small capital purchases where most is large. And so what's happening is that on the 10-year horizon, Island Health has identified a number of significant capital projects. So there's a building going in the West Shore that's going to come on board. We'll be on the hook for a third of that. There's a number of other ones that are not approved yet, but are in their wish list for the next 10 years. And so if all of those come to fruition, there's quite a substantial, it goes from about 125, I think, to about $250 a household increase over those 10 years. So it's a pretty substantial increase. But that's, again, a formulaic model and open for discussion. It's been flagged at the hospital district level because it's probably not entirely sustainable if all those major projects come online. But at this point, that's what the big knuckle is in the few years at the hospital district side.
So thanks for that answer. That kind of clarifies it. I wondered if I was understanding it right, watching some of the meetings and looking at the minutes. But because it does, part of the goal of this is, of course, as Mr. Coates said, to not just acquire new land and develop, but to also acquire existing portfolios. So I'm wondering about any constraints or modeling for that has to be done. And what I'm thinking about is if in fact you're taking on older buildings and needing to bring them up to speed or whatever that needs to be done to them to bring them to the level of housing you want, is there potential that the cost to the households within the district will increase because of the impact of life cycle costs for those buildings over the years? I mean, in order to produce affordable housing for some of this market or supportive housing, you're going to be at below kind of market rental rates. And so, in other words, greater subsidization would be required. So for the life cycle costs, if you're taking on those buildings, is that then going to increase our charges in a year, or has this been sort of factored into the modeling, what's been discussed?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. The short answer has been modeled, it's baked into the modeling. When land acquisition or buildings are built, the capital costs are essentially subsidized by the hospital district through the CRD, so that capital acquisition happens in there. The capital replacement and maintenance and operational costs are funded by the rents of those buildings. So even though they're below market, even where they're extremely low barrier rental pieces, they're typically then subsidized through BC Housing or through Island Health, and those help sort of top up those pieces so that there's a total cumulative amount that pays for staffing, pays for repairs, and pays for maintenance. So we've asked the question multiple times: are we falling short on the maintenance on these buildings? And they're generally not. I think where you'd see any acquisition of an older building, it would probably be for replacement, not for just acquisition for the case of running it. That the money here is for adding new units, not for just acquiring buildings, say, run by a third-party nonprofit housing operator or something. So that'd be the primary. Mr. Coates?
Thank you, Worship. I just wanted to clarify an earlier comment I made too, or maybe emphasize more strongly when I was talking about the CAO from the CRD talking about sort of where they see the primary focus of this extra funding going. It's to their existing units, so it's not so much acquiring them, it's taking them where they're at end of life and redoing them in a more densified fashion. That was the emphasis that he was putting across last week. And the other thing I wanted to mention too, just for the sort of the financial security point of view, is, we are talking about regional district services that are specifically funded through this establishing bylaw, and so that the authorization cap is currently at 5 million, and they're seeking it to be at 11.5 million. That's per year. So that can't increase beyond that threshold without bylaws coming back to council for that authorization to get further increased down the line, should that be necessary.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Mr. Coates. Anything else, Councillor Patterson?
Yeah, just particularly about the supportive housing and I guess longer term, the property administration for some of the other properties. Does the capacity exist currently in order to move these projects forward? Does it mean adding capacity, both on the VHA side? I know VHA will be in charge of certainly be responsible for the supportive housing aspect of counseling and supports that are needed for that type of housing. So, but I think for most of us, we don't think that VHA is tremendously overstaffed at the present time. So in doing all of this, is the capacity, does it need to be built up or does it exist already?
Yes, both of those two. So any project that requires Island Health operational factors has to be sort of go through an operational test of Island Health, and they have to basically approve that operational funding before those things get built or implemented. That's why it's sort of a three-way partnership. Most of this housing, however, is just low-income housing or below-market housing. And so they're just run by the the Housing Corporation staff. They currently operate about 2,000 below-market housing units in the CRD area. So this has a potential of adding quite a few more to that total.
Thank you for that. And one last question, just on the whole program, how are the auditing or reporting accountability, how is that managed?
Yeah, thank you. So the Housing Corporation and the Capital Regional District, which provides the capital funding, are both done through the annual financial reporting mechanisms at the CRD board, or the hospital district, or the Housing Corporation board. Those are all audited through a third-party auditing company that reviews the financials. So those all come back as audited financial statements, and that reporting comes back. So that's the oversight model of that. And the Housing Corporation reviews the financials for the Housing Corporation, and the CRD, of course, board reviews the CRD finances. Thank you. Yes, I'll go to Councillor Watson and then back to Councillor Green.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a couple questions. One's probably for you, and one I think is for Mr. Coates. It's the first time I've seen it in this report, the term naturally occurring affordable housing, which is one of the 6 priority areas for the use of these funds if they get that loan authorization. Mayor, would you have an example of what that is in their portfolio right now, or what they're particularly looking at when they use that term? And as sort of an add-on, would these be likely places where it's not just making sure the housing stays affordable, but there's opportunities for intensifying in an existing building?
Yeah, that's an interesting phrase that I don't remember ever being heard before. So can you tell me where it is in the report?
It occurs twice in the report when they give, oh geez, I've just scanned past the.
Is that in the bylaw or in the
It sounds
report?
like Councillor Patterson's been able to fast it. It's in the report, not in the bylaw.
And where was it in the report?
It's just a new buzzword, I think, that is requiring existing acquisitions and not
On page 6, they give their partnering opportunities in 6 areas. And the first one is protect and preserve NOAH in partnering with the RFPS. And I think they've used the term above there, because I actually saw that and then went back to find out I didn't even know what the acronym was.
Okay. Yeah, my apologies. I don't know what that is. I would just be guessing. I imagine it probably is pieces that, like, units that have been built some time ago and have naturally sort of aged and hit their piece.
Page 5. At the very bottom paragraph, page 5.
Yeah, okay, so this is the provincial, I think, project to acquire for nonprofit housing providers to acquire naturally occurring housing. So these would be private apartments that have, just naturally have lower rents because they've just aged out, and so the ability for they put in this fund to actually use to purchase these kind of apartment buildings so they stay lower cost. I believe that's what that's referring to.
Thank you, of which I can see there might even be some examples in our own community. Yeah, for sure. Thank you. And then my next question is to Mr. Coates, and it's about this consent process itself. Can you just clarify, what is the threshold for consent for this to go forward? Is it every participating municipality plus all the electoral areas, or? Anyway, over to you.
Mr. Coates?
No, Your Worship, through you, it's 2/3 of the participants, so 2/3 totaling the member municipalities and the electoral areas.
Thank you. And then just to follow up, so that even if they don't get unanimous consent, it's still imposed on the entire group, is that correct?
Through the mayor, yes, that's correct.
Yeah, and just little regional districts 101, there are regional and there's sub-regional services. Sub-regional can be opted in and out. This is a regional service which is paid into and benefited from by all member municipalities and electoral areas in the CRD. And sorry, Councillor Green, you had another question?
Yes, thank you. It was just a question, and Councillor Watson touched on it right at the end. Would Oak Bay qualify for that kind of housing? Given that we have challenges around affordable housing in this community, I would hope that we would qualify for some of those projects, only because we do have older buildings that are reaching end of life, and it would be terrific if we could qualify for one or two or three of those projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. Yeah, I think there's probably quite a few, given the age of a number of our wood frame 4-story apartment buildings that were built in the 60s, that would probably qualify for that program. Go ahead, Councillor Smart.
Thank you. Most of my questions have been answered, but I just had one just clarification. I just wondered, and I'm not sure who would be best to answer it, but understanding that the current requisition has already been slated towards that RHFP, and so this is an additional one. Are we expecting that the full amount of this new requisition is very likely to be claimed next year and every year? I'm just wondering, based on historically what's happened, do we have an anticipation of whether it's going to be fully accessed?
Thank you. Actually, the short answer is probably no. It's probably going to come in over time as different capital projects become available. And part of this is also there is obviously, just like there was with the Regional Housing First program, a desire to see the province and the federal government step up and join us in some of these acquisition pieces, because they're obviously more successful in those situations where we can do financing through CMHC and we can do some additional supports and funding through the BC Housing. So we expect these probably to be a little bit dependent upon once the bylaw passes, and then we get into some of the budgeting cycle pieces, but dependent a little bit on how fast the province and the federal government can step up, and we can start looking at partnerships. I would anticipate, I don't know for sure, it would be over a number of years before the full amount would be the full 85,000. You think about that in totality, that's a $25.5 million in capital, which would be again leveraged to borrow. Several hundred, maybe a few $100 million of capital work. So it's quite a significant amount of money. Just need. You have another. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you. Interesting opportunities and challenges, I guess, on this. But I'm just wondering, when you looked at compiling the increase in funds with this, proportionately, do we know where that would kind of leave this region in leveraging stimulus from the province, say for this region as compared to the rest of the province? I know Vancouver and immediate areas does leverage a lot of money, but how will doing this proportionately increase our leverage for stimulus?
I'll probably take a shot at that one. I don't know. I wouldn't know if I call it stimulus. I think the reality is that most federal and provincial programs require an investment from the local government as well. So by allowing a requisition up to $5.5 million, which leverages up to $85 million in borrowing, that gets us, if we can find, we're hoping for a higher percentage of the federal and provincial governments. It's traditionally been a higher portion than that. But, the hope is at least one-third, one-third. Without that, we probably won't get the 85 million from the province or 85 million from the Fed. So it's sort of one of those, we probably won't get anything if we don't have funding on our end to do it. And we've typically asked for money, that the funding has gone towards sort of direct capital acquisition, and this is a slightly different model where we're asking for a requisition up to this amount, and then using that to leverage to borrow money to fund a much larger amount to go to the province and the federal government with. So we're kind of buying forward as opposed to using savings in this situation. Those are the other questions. I'm happy to, if people are comfortable, to maybe move the recommendation or an alternate.
Move receipt.
Take receipt first, moved and seconded for receipt. We don't usually discuss receipt. All those in favor? Any opposed, not opposed? I apologize. This is open for public input, and I didn't ask that. If there's anybody from the public who wishes to address us, there's no hands being raised right now, but I'll give it a second to for that to percolate through. Are there any other questions as we wait for any of the public? I'm just going to speak in favor of this motion. I do think that, and there was a question sort of asked about what is the impact of this on Oak Bay. It will proportionally be higher. We've traditionally, as a per capita entity, paid quite considerably the highest amount in the region, and it's just by the nature of the formula. So the formula is based on land value and converted assessments and population. And so we have a reasonably small population and a reasonably high land value. Because commercial land value is undervalued in that formulaic model, it tends to reside heavily on residential. So by its very nature, Oak Bay tends to pay a fairly high portion of the share. That being said, the number there is probably not too far off the mark in terms of what the average household cost would be. Certainly in the order of magnitude pieces, if it's $76 on average, it would probably be in the neighborhood of maybe $100 or something for Oak Bay. It wouldn't be $300 or $400 in that situation. All right, that's my only additional explanation to use up some time. I don't see any other hands. Councillor Smart,
I'm willing to move the recommendation.
moved and seconded. Thank you.
Did we call a question on receipt yet?
Oh, did I call? I did not. My apologies. All those in favor of receipt? Any opposed, not opposed? Mr. Coates, before.
Thank you, Worship. So I should have pointed out when I introduced this item that staff haven't made a recommendation for your consideration on this. Rather, the recommendation was to consider it. If council wishes to consent to the adoption of the bylaw, we have that motion ready for you. If you want to do that, or if council wishes another direction, we can improvise that and put it on the screen as fast as you say it.
So I'm just going to go. So it's at the bottom of the primary report. Is that correct? Nope.
I
No,
think
Your Worship,
it's-
it would actually, if council wished to consent, that motion is there for you now to look at.
I think it says that,
Council give consideration of consent.
yeah, for the CRD Land Assembly Housing and Land Banking Service Establishment bylaw. I'll make that motion.
Do you want to just read the whole thing? Bylaw number 1,
Bylaw
2010.
number 1, 2010, amendment bylaw number
2,
2, 2022.
3.
3. It looks like a 2 from here.
I just need glasses. Moved and seconded. Okay. Is there any discussion or debate on this at this point? Councillor Green?
I just have one question. If there was a major economic catastrophe or downturn, recession, and people are talking about it, would that particular tax be impacted? In other words, would it go down? I know that's unheard of. Taxes rarely go down, but is it subject to the vagaries of the market?
No.
Okay, thank you.
No, the answer, sorry. I shook my head, which doesn't translate well to TV or online. No. So this would be like any other requisition-based model. It would float with the value of the land. So if the overall market dropped by 10%, the requisition would still be, say, $1, and it would just be a higher percentage of that value, but the actual requisition number would stay the same.
Thank you.
Okay. Although, if the value of land went down, then we could buy more land and build more for the same amount of money. So, that's slight positive in that whole scenario. I don't see any other discussion, so I'm happy to call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed? That carries. Thank you very much. We move to 7.3, also open to public input. If anybody wishes to address us, please indicate that online at this time. This is our correspondence management policy. Mr. Coates, I'll give this to you. And I know just from a bit of conversation that's happened around that there's probably enough questions and seeking of clarity that we might want to just provide some for the table here. some direction back to staff if there's a sufficient amount of changes to make, that we'll send it back and come back as opposed to trying to wordsmith everything. But Mr. Coates, I'll hand this over to you and as an introduction.
Thank you, Your Worship, members of council. So before you is a draft correspondence management policy. Just a bit of background. So in 2020, when council of the day completed a fairly lengthy process to amend the council procedure bylaw, sort of riding shotgun with that bylaw was a set of public correspondence guidelines that were never presented for council's approval, but were presented, I understand, as part of the conversation going along. And so from a best practices perspective, staff feel that having council endorse that and having it be a council adopted policy is a more standard approach to that. And it also provides sort of a bit more certainty and formality around the procedures that are followed, and in particular that's around correspondence that's submitted for council and to council. And so for the most part, you'll note that there's 3 attachments, the last one of which is a red-lined copy which shows what is new from those existing guidelines that have been in place and in practice since sometime in 2020. And so there's a few changes that were proposed, and they're basically around publishing times and creating transparency for the public on when they submit correspondence that might be coming along with a matter that council's considering, and those sort of things, and creating some understanding for the public that there's a time at which that can be submitted and get published before the meeting, and then otherwise it's going to be circulated to council as best as possible based on when it's received. And that covers off any correspondence that council might receive, and includes things such as public hearings, despite the fact that those might become somewhat obsolete going forward in the future. But so staff, in bringing this forward, really wrapped up what existing practice was, made a few suggestions around that transparency, enhancement, and certainty for the public, and really just present this for council to give consideration to as to whether you'd like it to be a policy, whether that would remain the way it's submitted, or whether it would have changes proposed by council. I think that the bottom line is it was there in 2020. It hasn't had the degree of sort of endorsement that one might normally like to see with that, and that's why this is before you for your consideration, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Coates. Are there questions of staff on this? Go ahead, Councillor Appleton and Smart.
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. So just basically given your comments in the preamble there, I've got some fairly significant potential edits to the existing document that I'd like to see entertained. But given your comments about not, doing the wordsmithing in this avenue, are we just going to move forward with, I won't go into the details of asking the questions if we're going to move forward with deferring the item or referring it back to staff for changes.
I think what I'd like to ask is if there's concerns or ideas about the way that it's framed, or that if there's lack of clarity, that we just sort of raise those for consideration, and then we can send it back for staff to do the wordsmithing and come back to us with a revised version. So I think those sorts of edits are worth just bringing up, as maybe not sharing your specific words that you'd replace them with, but certainly raising the rationale for changing it.
Well, thank you, Your Worship. Okay, then I will proceed with a few questions just about some specifics. The draft policy under section 2.1.3 refers specifically to council or councillors not responding to requests or comments on operational matters, and I understand the intent of that more broadly. But operational matters are the bulk of what council receives questions about, and so I'd like more specificity on what's being used. It's not included in the glossary here. So operational matters I would see as being closely tied to levels of service, or those things which are governed by the existing financial plan, but there are plenty of operational matters that may sit outside of that. So I'd just like clarification on what defines an operational matter in this context.
Mr. Coates?
Thank you, Your Worship. And so that's a great question, and it's also one that's a little bit challenging to quantify in a tidy way, but if you think about it in terms of council sits as policy decision makers and staff sit as operational doers. And so if it's something staff's already doing, as a matter of course, that's the business that staff perform for the community. That's how I would sort of earmark operational versus, is it something that somebody would like done that the district doesn't do already? And then that becomes a policy consideration. That's the shortest answer I have, and I'm not sure if that's sufficiently detailed or yet too great.
I might just do a quick follow-up on that to Councillor Appleton's question, because this comes under the correspondence dash general. And it's, I think, generally speaking, is this, because I was reading that same thing too, and is there perhaps some preamble that could be included there that would explain what that actually means? Because it's not clear whether that's still general inquiries coming into OB Council, or is it just general inquiries that come into the municipality, or are they, and some of those definitions might be included in some sort of preamble to the general? Because I read that was unclear about what the general referred to.
Thank you, Worship. So, so I think correspondence that comes in generally is not addressed to mayor and council. So the dividing line is what's addressed to council and what's not. So if it's addressed to the district and it's received through some other means, versus what comes into the Obey Council inbox or what comes into council members' email inboxes or into their hard copy mailboxes and those sort of things. So there's two different types of correspondence here for sure. But I think the fundamental approach that the public correspondence guidelines currently employ are trying to divide that off as to what is something that would be a policy matter that council would weigh in on or give consideration to changing service levels or providing new services, or something that's not being done, versus is it something that the district is doing and it's a service request, or it's seeking clarification on what does the district do in these instances, letting staff manage those types of correspondence without the politicization of it.
Sorry, go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Worship, and I do appreciate that clarification, because there is a difference. I think it is useful to determine between things that council is already, or the district is already doing, versus things that are prospective to do. I think that's useful context. I would certainly advocate that there be some sort of language incorporated that clearly defines that itemizes that or codifies that in some ways, just for clarity for everybody's purposes, and does create the space for council to comment on policy matters with respect to operational matters that may not be currently in place that council may wish to entertain in a future planning process. If I may continue, Your Worship, I just wanted to make reference
Before you
to...
do, I just want to make note here, just if I see notes being taken here, as Councillor Appleton was talking about the codification of the operational pieces, there's a lot of nodding around the table that makes sense to do, so I may just kind of come back to that one just to get some validation at the end of this process. But go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Worship. Just under section 2.2.3, which is under correspondence addressed to mayor and council, it does just use language. It says, respond to requests that are routine in nature and where such information is readily available to the public. I'm not certain about the use of that specific kind of language. I understand that it's matters that are available to the public, but it is fairly par for the course that councillors are asked to provide further detail or further context for information that may be available in the public sphere, but may not be necessarily easily interpreted by members of the public. So I'm wondering about the language routine in nature and readily available to the public. Some information may be available to the public, but may need context. So, and may require a depth of knowledge about that subject that, a casual observer might not have. So that's just an observation on that one, Your Worship. Under section 2.2.4, which is a new added section with respect to enhanced levels of service being brought forward by notice of motion. I'm not sure the significance of, I think that point is valid, although I don't think that council is restricted. I don't think it needs to be codified in a policy in this way. As far as I understand it from the existing procedures bylaw, members of council are able to bring forward various matters under notice of motion, this and other things included. So I think that this may be potentially duplicative, or in my view, it might not necessarily be necessary, but I would encourage actually that be excluded, because it would seem, if interpreted the wrong way, could restrict individual councillors' discretion to bring forward items under notice of motion. But maybe I'm reading that incorrectly.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Go ahead, Mr. Coates.
Thank you, Your Worship. And so to that question, so actually, this is really to enhance and articulate the inherent ability a council member has to action something, and thinking about it wrapped into a correspondence policy. So this is something that's a piece of correspondence has been addressed to mayor and council. It doesn't fit. It's not a staff response, because it's a policy matter. It's something that's for a decision of council, or it's a new heightened level of service for something. And so it's creating a clear ramp for that information to come forward. It's not at the expense of the other opportunities, but it's specifically responding to a piece of correspondence. What can be done with one that comes in that talks about a new service or a heightened service level, and that just creating that clear ramp for that to come forward through that process in this policy. So it's really just intended to make more clear what can happen to a person's public correspondence that they submit to council that isn't fitting in a box that staff can deal with it, and it's not going to show up on a council agenda either, unless a member brings it forward as a notice of motion. Because there are lots of municipalities that will have a lot of community correspondence that will come forward on their agendas. That practice has reduced over time, but and certainly smaller municipalities will have a pathway for correspondence to hit their agenda, and around this region not so much, and creating that opportunity for it to come forward, so the public knows that if they want to appeal to a council member to advocate for something that they're interested in seeing, that's the way it can come forward.
Thank you. Can I just ask one follow-up on that one? It's just, these are always big gray area matters, and there are times when it might be something that isn't necessarily rising to the level of a notice of motion, but might be, you haven't, I don't know, there's some minor change, we need to grind down the edge of a sidewalk, or do some kind of operational type things that are not sort of notice of motion, maybe a slight change in service level, but they're not really rising to that level. So is there anything required here to also just articulate that there's a mechanism here of, you get an email from someone directly, you say, that actually makes a lot of sense, and you can forward it to staff to look at. It might be a change of service, but it's not notice of motion worthy. It's really reasonably minor in nature that would go to the CAO for consideration of whether that could be added into a work plan or something.
Thank you, Your Worship. And I think, that this document isn't intended, nor is any policy typically, to encompass every possible situation. But again, I think the dividing line there, is it operational? Is it something that staff can just action because it makes sense? It could be bringing a hazard forward or something like that. And sometimes folks will send that correspondence to mayor and council because they don't know where else to send it. And they want to make sure that it's received. And then that's the purpose of this policy, is to try to categorize that. So yeah, we can action that. It doesn't need another process, or it's something larger than that would need another process. And we have different responses that go back to the people who send the correspondence in, based on what the nature of it is. So that pathway would be made more clear to them in that response as well.
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Worship. I think that's a useful follow-up. Thank you for that. Just one final thing that I just wanted to point out, not necessarily a wording change, but under section 2.2.8, referring to the mayor being the district spokesperson responsible for explaining council policies, priorities, and decisions to the public. Clear that is the case, although it's not exclusively in the mayor's purview to do so. We do so on a regular basis as individual members of council. So. And did so just this afternoon in my role as council liaison. So I think it might be useful to further elaborate just in terms of the role of the mayor and the role of councillors under this section, just so it is not almost from a functional point of view that unnecessary things are not directed, the bulk of things are not necessarily directed to the mayor with the vision that that's the only person who can respond to a policy matter. And councillors should feel able to comment on the policies and the decisions of council, provided that they represent them as the will of council.
Mr. Coates, any comments on that?
Thank you, Your Worship. So it's hard to, I struggle staying in the box with this as well, because this is geared around correspondence as being the trigger for any of this. So it's exclusive of a general proposition where council members are free agents, speak freely on matters of interest to them on any number of subjects, but rather the trigger here is the district's received a piece of correspondence, and that in the instance of that, this recognizes a practice. And again, this was an existing provision, and we didn't, and we can certainly revise any provisions in here that council wishes to be revised. But this exercise was less about that and more about putting this into a package that was perhaps more appropriate and enhancing transparency. So in terms of this, if there's a change desired for that particular clause, it can be broadened, it could be expanded. And there's other parts of this policy or draft policy that talk about a member of council being in a position to respond. And members can respond at will, and so it's not intended to be a limiting factor in here that the mayor will in any situation, because I don't recall anything drafted here that suggests a member of council can't either. But I don't know if that's helpful, but the genesis of this provision I'm not familiar with particularly, but again, it's just sort of a rooting mechanism.
Councillor Appleton?
Thank you, Your Worship, and I appreciate Mr. Coates' comments on this. My reason for bringing this up is less with the intention of wanting to wordsmith specific content, but just because I'm conscious that what we're doing is we're bringing something, and as outlined in the staff report, we're bringing something that formerly was a guideline, a public correspondence guideline, and using a fair chunk of the same language and moving it over to policy. And so my intent is to get the communications outward clear to everybody. If it's going to become policy, then it implies operational approach or the approach taken to dealing with things. So it's my intention to kind of get the intent of individual statements in the policy right, because it carries to me a certain degree more weight as a council policy rather than a guideline, which it was formerly. But I'll yield the floor, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. I'll go to Mr. Coates, and then I have a order of Smart, Green, and then Braithwaite, and then Watson.
Thank you, Your Worship. And I perhaps was a little too brief in my remarks around the premise of that Section 8, which is that language generally reflects the mayor's authority in the community charter too, and it sort of parallels that mayors are generally the chief spokesperson, and there's a set of stipulations in the charter that talk about the distinction between the mayor and other members of council. And I think that this would certainly follow along with that, but it doesn't have to be limiting in that sense. And yeah, so it's certainly, it could be softened if that was council's desire.
Thank you. And as the mayor, I don't want this to reflect that only I'm allowed to respond on things. So I think if that's, I look at this in a future of, 10 years from now, someone's looking at this policy. Is it clear what the intent of this is? And I think that might be a little bit murky in terms of people reading that to say, oh, I'm not allowed to respond because it's the mayor's job. So I think that's the question to be asking ourselves is the language clear enough to be understood where the attention is there? I have Councillor Smart, Green, Braithwaite, then Watson. And then Patterson.
Thank you. I will try to be concise. I have a few questions that are just wanting clarification on interpretation. Through you, Mayor, to Mr. Coates, 2.2.2, when the term is used regarding district business, I'm wondering, does that mean that we potentially send every email that we receive to the corporate officer and then every member of council will receive copies of email, or is district business like a tinier fragment of correspondence?
Mr. Coates.
Thank you, Worship, and thank you for the question, because I think it's important to spend a couple of moments on that notion, because policies get written with the best of intentions, and language is used, and there's judgment that's exercised in these kinds of situations, because council members can get correspondence of a very broad range. So I think about certain principles, which is if you're doing it as a member of council, it's a record of the municipality. So when it's a record of the municipality, and we have a section in here about records management as well, which is all intended in the same vein, is that if it's district business, there's supposed to be a permanent record of it, especially when it's a written communication. But if somebody said, and I would be perhaps remiss to come up with a specific situation, but is the night market going to be on next week? Doesn't require a submission around the room. It's a simple question. Sometimes folks don't know where to ask the question to, and council members will receive those kinds of things. Most often those would get responded to before there's ever much of an opportunity to do something else. But it's coming up with a judgment around what is something that ought to be a permanent record of the municipality and kept for posterity and for future use. I also think about it in terms of service requests or anything along those kind of lines where if we don't track it somehow, we can't quantify how many of those requests we get. And those are the kind of triggers I think about for making a judgment call on, does this need to be circulated around? I hope that might be helpful.
Thank you. It sounds like we might be able to better define the district business into that section, that so that we're a bit more clear about what might trigger that. Go ahead, Councillor Smart.
Oh, thank you. Through you, Mayor, again to Mr. Coates. 2.2.3. So I just, again, thinking about the sort of sending of emails and then the CCing and copying of emails back. I saw this item particularly as something that may not currently be fully happening, and I'm just wondering what the implications would be of all of us now receiving copies of all of these things that everyone is writing to each other. And so I just wondered if you could elaborate on whether you see this as a change to what's currently happening.
Mr. Coates.
Thank you, Worship, and again, thanks for the question. So this is a continuing provision from the existing guidelines, and so it's as effective as folks make it, or as members of council utilize it. And again, I think these things can be hard to quantify in terms of language in a policy, and I fear a little bit about trying to get so prescriptive that we end up sort of getting confused versus making a decision based on the content of a matter. Is that something that other members of council are going to benefit from hearing the response to, or is it really just a one-off that might not be that much of a concern? And so is this being employed? I wouldn't know, and I don't mean that in a cheeky way, but I mean this is part of the internal conversation that would go on. And is it something new? No. And is there any change anticipated by having this as a policy document versus a guideline? No, because I think in practice, this is how it's been. These are the regulations, the rules, the guidelines that are in place already, and they're only as effective as they're utilized. And we haven't done a good job of informing council of that this term as this new members of council. I don't know what happened in 2020, but that's simply where we're at with this. And part of this was bringing this forward as an opportunity to have those conversations around communications that weren't able to occur otherwise.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think, and I'm not trying to wordsmith or be critical. I just, when I first read that, my interpretation was that your example of when is the night market would apply to this one. And I don't think that that is the case, that everybody wants to receive copies of all those emails. So it's good to hear the interpretation of that. Moving on to 2.2.6, I was just curious again to me, when I read this, it sounds like all non-operational letters might trigger agenda items, and I'm sure I'm misunderstanding it, but could you give me an example of 2.2.6?
Mr. Coates?
So I just had to reacquaint myself with this provision. So this is intended to capture correspondence that's related to matters that council will be considering on an agenda. And so council members will be aware that there are numerous pieces of correspondence at times, depending on the issue, attached to matters that you're considering on your agendas. And so the public's aware of that, and it's just trying to create the understanding about how that'll happen. So if, for example, we get oftentimes weeks before an agenda is actually produced, the public will be aware that council is going to be considering something at a meeting, and we will start receiving correspondence. We package that, place it on the agenda, and have it there for transparency, for your benefit, and for the public's benefit to see what folks are saying, and that's what's intended to be captured here.
Councillor Smart?
Okay, thank you for that. Just one more, and then I'll give some airtime to some other people. 2.2.8, it was just question perhaps for the mayor. I was just curious what whether this would be seen as a change to the sort of amount of emails that would be shared with council, or you see this very much as what is happening today?
Yeah, in truth, it's not, to answer your question, Councillor Smart, not really what's happening today, and I perhaps we should have read the policy more closely in past times as to where it goes, but this one is kind of an odd one, because most correspondence back and forth I would not CC, council on, or the CAO, but there are certainly times when there's a response that it makes sense to do so. So I read this, and similar to Councillor Appleton's, I don't think it's reasonable to expect only the mayor's responding, because that's just a bottleneck of lack of responsiveness. That would be a bad thing. And two, I don't think that's, my job is to be the official spokesperson for decisions, but not for all communications on pieces. So it isn't really reflective of what's been going on to this date. And I think some grayness in the policy makes sense, but I think maybe some more clarification if there's something that comes in as to where that gets shared and where it doesn't would be helpful. I think if there's big issue things, then that would typically be where I would send a response and then send that response to members of council so they were aware of a response that went out. But that wouldn't happen on most correspondence pieces. It could, I suppose, happen. I could just have my executive assistant, somebody do a batch once a week or something like that, and say, here's correspondence that's gone out in respect to certain issues, and do that. But then I may fill up a lot of inboxes with stuff that may not be valuable. So it doesn't really reflect what's happening right now. Now have council.
Thank you. I'm not going to go into real specifics in terms of the paper, and I really appreciate your effort. This is not an easy one. I looked at it from above, and my first question is, what is it we're trying to fix? That was my first question. So do we understand what it is we want to fix? And then I looked at the user friendliness of how we communicate. So this is really, I see this correspondence as a tool, as part of a broader communications framework. And I think that's why I would like to see it put into that context. I think it would be helpful to have a flow chart on the website that describes the correspondence process. It would be helpful to inform the public and answer the question, what happens when I write to council? Because that seems to be a recurring question, what happens? I think providing a target timeline for responses and actions where possible is important. And I think it should also speak to media requests and broader internal communications. I think this procedural bylaw and the correspondence guidelines were created during COVID in 2020 at a time when we were completely disconnected from each other and from our community and from staff. And I think it was a really tough time for everybody. I think it would be prudent of us to go back and look at this now as a review process. Does this still work for us? I'm concerned with some of the language, just the must not, council must not do this and must not do that. You want a policy to be flexible as time and circumstances change, and I think things have changed since 2020, and maybe it's time to reframe both these guidelines and our communications framework generally. And so that's the way I approach this. I really appreciate the efforts made. I would find some of this onerous and cumbersome, I have to be honest. If I have to copy for every email I receive, I have to share that with everybody and so on and so forth. I think I'm hopefully following the practice that everything goes in terms of requests for levels of service and so on and problems and so on. Those go to the CAO and then they're distributed and dealt with from there. I think that's a really simple approach. I think it works. I'm afraid we're complicating something that isn't horribly complicated, I guess is the way I'm feeling about it. With all due respect, and I could be wrong, but I think guidelines are a really good place to stay. I'm concerned about codifying this into policy. So generally, that's how I feel, and that these are tools and elements of a broader communication. And those include correspondence, website, press releases, media inquiries, resident inquiries. Those are all part and parcel. So those are my comments, and I hope they're taken in good faith. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. Mr. Coates, I'm just going to turn over to you because I think, can you just maybe articulate why we have a correspondence policy? Like, what is the value here from a records management? What is important to keep as permanent records? What's important to kind of from a communication sharing perspective so people are sort of on the same page and not surprised by something? What is the way, to Councillor Green's point, I think it is, what is this fixing? What are we actually resolving with this? And I think it will give us a bit of a framework for consideration of what changes we want to make.
Thank you, Worship. So let me say this. So again, I feel compelled to reiterate that most of this is existing in a guideline. The notion of converting it to policy is to take it out of relative obscurity and put it in council's at council's table where it belongs, where there can be public conversation and clarity and transparency around how things are managed and why. And so that was the premise on which this came forward. And rather than reinventing and re-engineering or restructuring the content of that, there's very few strike-throughs here, and there was a couple of things that were considered to be rather operational and rather issues that would be taken for granted and don't necessarily need to reside anywhere. And then enhancing the transparency pieces of this for the public to give clarity. I can tell you that staff struggle in the hours before a council meeting when there's an agenda full of public commentary on making the cut line to when we publish something and when we stop, because we have to consider overall transparency. We have to consider council members' ability to see it before you make decisions. And at some point, so that the 2 p.m. time has a practical, I'm keying on one element of this, and it might not be what you're really that interested in, but this is the new part, and it's purposeful around why this has come forward, because we felt there was a weakness in our system that didn't give us the ability to make those decisions, and we felt very strongly that should be discussion council should have about what's appropriate, because more than anyone, council members need to know there's this correspondence because you want to see it before you make your decision. And folks have an expectation that when they submit it, you're going to. So we made a decision on this one, for example, that 2 o'clock is a good time to cut it off. And if there's more correspondence that comes in, we're going to print it for you and we're going to give it to you so you can't help but see it, instead of when did I check the agenda last, and when staff send that final sort of notification that here's the latest changes to the agenda, and typically that will note that correspondence has been added. But we still receive stuff afterwards, and we have an obligation to get that to you.
I do have my little notes here to express my appreciation for that clarity. I think that was a really good addition in there.
Yeah, and so maybe to belabor that point more than I should have, but anyway, on the premise of why is this coming forward? Because we believe that this is a council policy document and it doesn't exist in that form right now. And in any practical way, does that really change or increase the emphasis? I would assert that it increases the transparency as opposed to increases the practices that are exercised.
Thanks for that. Councillor Braithwaite, then Watson, then Patterson.
Thanks so much. Actually, Councillor Appleton asked a couple of my questions, and Councillor Green kind of talked a little bit about how I was feeling as well, so that was good clarification. Thank you. I do have a couple of things. In 2.11, it talks about that a response will be provided. It doesn't talk about a timing in there. Should there be a timing in there, or is that something? Because I know we as a municipality have often said we'll get back to people within 24 hours. Does that need to be written here, or I saw you smile, so I'm interested to hear your answer on that.
Votes?
Thank you, Your Worship. And it's a terrific thing, and it's something that was struggled with in terms of how was this going to get packaged and brought to you? Because automatically you'd think a target would be reasonable to place in there, that we will staff will respond to an item within a reasonably defined time period. And again, so not re-engineering the existing content, but supplementing it. Could it be added? Could targets be added? Yes, as you all know, I won't be here for that, and I'm a little reluctant to make commitments, right? And Ms. Williams, I think, would have an awful lot to say about that from an ability to meet those targets perspective, but certainly it could be.
Thank you, and through the mayor to you. I also struggled with with what Councillor oh God, Smart. I said a little brain fart there, sorry. Councillor Smart said in regards to having to forward all of the emails that I answered to everybody. I'm like, it would be horrible. But I liked what you said about it's the ones that we're doing is for a permanent record for the municipality. So for example, if somebody emails me and says, hey, I haven't heard back from staff in regards to X, I answer them and I say, thank you for letting me know. I'm going to forward it on to the CAO. I'm not going to forward that to everybody else. I mean, because that would be just asinine, but I am going to forward it to the CAO. So that was a good clarification for that. So thank you. The other thing I had here was, on 2.2.7, it says, correspondence deemed by the corporate officer not to comply with section 2.27 of this policy, but shouldn't it say 2.26? Okay, thank you. And then the other thing, 2.32. I was wondering if 2.32 should also include regular mail as well, because it says under consideration provided that it's submitted to the email address noted by 2 p.m. on the day of the meeting. Should it not also say that we've received in-house as well, like snail mail, or?
Your Worship, thank you. Yes, it should say that.
And I think there was one other spot that it said something about that as well. I don't know if I wrote that down. And then my next question is where is it? Oh no, hang on. Number 11, 2.211. I would like to see that number 11 not come off. I think it's really important that a response is given to a resident when an item has been included on the agenda. I think that's quite important to me. That's part of how we relate to the residents, and so I'm not sure how the mayor feels about that, but.
What I care about doesn't matter. Mr. Coates, I did note that as well, so perhaps you can just explain.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you for the question. So this is one of those sections I was talking about, the couple that are being removed, because one could take that for granted that that will occur, and that it doesn't need to be spelled out in a policy. That is how we do business. That is how the business is done. And so when somebody writes in and a matter is being considered, they are advised, and that can be taken for granted and really doesn't need to be embedded in a council policy. That is a matter of course for any matter that comes before council.
Just for the record here, this is referring to after an agenda item has been concluded, that there have been a correspondence saying, you know, the agenda item has been considered and here's the outcome of that. So it'd be, I think, a case where someone wrote an email that ended up as an agenda item, and then that circled back to them sort of with the outcome of that, not that it's going on the agenda if there was something they brought forward. Ms. Williams?
Thank you, Your Worship. I think this dates back to the time before we had fully webcast meetings, and a lot of the correspondence was coming in by snail mail. Now, I mean, I would estimate probably 95% comes in by email, and they get notification that it's going on the agenda. Here's where you can watch the meeting or read the minutes. So we don't follow up post-meeting the way we used to back in the snail mail days. But we do allow people, you know, an opportunity to know where it's going to be presented and where they can view the outcome of that discussion.
Okay, I'm going to Councilor Braithwaite. You have the floor.
I'll leave that one to you. Yeah, and then the only other thing, and I think Councillor Appleton brought this up, that there's some of the verbiage where it says must not. I don't like the sound of must not when I feel that correspondence and dealing with the public is part of my job. Like it's 95% of my job is to be able to converse with the public. So when I see the words must not respond, I take offense to that. So I would prefer that the language was softened also.
Mr. Coates, any thoughts on that in terms of the guidance? You don't have to. I'm happy to move on to other comments here. We get to.
Well, Your Worship, I can just say that, again, trying to sort of divide out the operational matters from the policy and decision point matters that council's going to consider. So it's, there's a school of thought around making sure that the person responsible for the circumstances connects with the person with the inquiry or the service request or that sort of thing in order to help facilitate that, because sometimes there's nuances of things that can get picked up in those conversations, and it's really important for staff to have that dialogue with people so that they understand more and better the implications of that. And I know that's the premise for this section.
Okay, thank you for that. Go ahead, Councilor Braithwaite.
And I do understand that, and so I'm not saying that I want to be able to answer on behalf of the municipality. What I am saying is that when I see the words must not, and someone has emailed me and said, can you please help me, can you help get my issue that I've had for the past 6 months seen to, and I just answer back, yes, I can help you, I'll forward it on to the CAO. That's all I want to be able to do, but when I read it, when I say must not, I'm like, I can't even talk to them about that.
Mr. Coates?
Your Worship, thank you. And that's not what this is intended to capture at all, is that connection and saying that, but it's more along the routing. And so the response, the context for the use of the term response there is to actually answer the question or to sort of deal with it that way rather than simply acknowledging and referring it and saying, yes.
Okay, thank you. And I want to get through this item here reasonably quickly, but Councillor Watson and then Patterson.
Thank you, Mayor. Most of this is going to be through you to Mr. Coates. Just some a comment. First, I just want to acknowledge that I was not here when the guideline was first introduced, so some of what I may ask about may be clear to everybody, and it's not quite so clear to me. But before I start about specific things, I just wanted to hearken back to Councillor Green's comments, because I do agree with her high-level view about this and the need for it. And I just wanted to say that if we do end up deciding that we want to move from guideline to policy, I do still think there is a need to make that policy as clear as possible to the public, because in a linear written form, it's really hard to take it in. I had also made a note to myself that a flow chart, or maybe it's multiple flow charts, might help explain this to the public so they know where they fit into the process and what expectations are. Because I think sometimes pictures really do speak 1,000 words. So that's just about a comment about that. But I'd like to just start at the top, because I want to make sure that I understand this. The definition of correspondence, when I read it, implies to me that it's everything that I receive by email in my inbox. And I wanted to know if there's any distinction there between public and private correspondence, notwithstanding the fact that anything I receive is FOI-able. So that's just at the highest level. I want to understand what we truly mean by correspondence.
Mr. Coates.
Thank you, Your Worship. And again, thanks for the question. So I do want to draw an important distinction between what is information that can be requested to be accessed under the Freedom of Information and Protection and Privacy Act versus what's not, because a council member could use your council inbox to have a personal conversation about something unrelated to your role, and that's not captured. The subject matter is the trigger to whether or not something is accessible under the Freedom of Information and Protection and Privacy Act, because it's a double-barreled piece of legislation and there's a lot of privacy in the personal communication. So that's not really something that's captured. And the rule of thumb is don't use your council address for those things, but they happen. They happen organically and unintentionally and innocuously. But in terms of what is a piece of correspondence, it's a matter of substance, I guess, is how I describe it, is about business of the municipality. And so that leaves it pretty wide open. But again, if it was a question around, is the night market on tonight, that probably isn't one that's necessary to be captured. But is it something that the municipality is in regularly, or is being sought out to become a participant of a service or consideration of issues that are important to the community? That's a record. And we try hard, but of course, back in the old days, it was a lot easier because it only came in by physical correspondence, and then the fax machine came in. That was still very easy to manage. Email is a game changer in terms of how people can access anyone. And so we would, in a perfect world, people in my role would like to say, well, everything's a record if it's about municipal business. But I think there is some division there around what's significant and what's substantive and what is something that ought to be a public record, and those are what we're trying to capture with correspondence in the context of this.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just if I could, just a couple follow-ups then. With respect to 2.2.2, we have touched on that, but I just wondered if there's some way to provide some clarification if this does become policy about what things you actually do want to receive from individual councillors back to the corporate officer, and so that the public's clear about that too. And I have a question about 2.4. Which is with regard to things that come in about future meetings of council. And I just wondered, how far prospectively forward are we looking? Because I'm wondering how a writer who sends us this stuff is actually going to know that their item is going to be the subject of an upcoming staff report.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Mr. Coates?
Thank you, Your Worship. I wish I had the answer to that question. No, I'm being a bit cheeky there, but it's surprising. There's there's a lot of communication ahead of time, and oftentimes that's because there's land use applications or those sort of things, which is something we get a lot of correspondence on. And sometimes it's through communications with members of council. Sometimes it's through communications with staff. Somebody will contact staff and say, I'm concerned about this kind of an issue. Oh, we happen to have a report coming, and the next thing you know, there's sort of the process takes shape, and folks start submitting information, because the public, because we're not always aware what's happening at a meeting 2 meetings from now either, but these are generally speaking larger issues that folks have some investment in, and there is some general public awareness of them coming forward.
Thank you. And I think that, thank you, Mr. Coates. I think that sort of goes back to the point that communicating this clearly to the public too, so that they understand the process is really part of this. And then just one final thing, 2.5.2. I don't, oh, maybe that's not it. 2.5.2. I'm not seeing it. 2.5.2. It has something, oh gosh. It's the language to do with what, removed from where and filed where. It was something to do with things
so
coming.
it says communications from external bodies for which council members sit as members of boards or committees are to be removed or filed
Yes,
as requested by
yes,
council
yes,
members by the
yes.
executive assistant of the CEO or mayor. Mr. Coates?
And I just wondered what those terms removed from and filed exactly where.
Your Worship, Ms. Williams just made my day, because she said, I've been trying to figure that one out myself. And I looked at this before and had an earlier question on it, and I read it enough times to get cross-eyed, and I really am not able to really ascertain what the intention here was. When we talk about communications from external bodies, sure, council members will get them. What this really means, I must confess, this was a copy and paste from the guidelines, and I don't know.
That's everything for me. We'll leave you with that puzzle. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Patterson.
Gee, now I have to remember what I wanted to talk about after listening to everyone else. But and a number of the comments that have been made, I agree with. Certainly, Councillor Green's comments I agree with, and Councillor Braithwaite's about some of the language. It's hard to take. However, that's been said. So this has evolved considerably since the guideline that it was intended for. And it was, at that time, what it said was means guidelines developed by the district for receiving and processing correspondence from another government, an agency, or a member of the public addressed to mayor and council or the district. And so it was clearly about council business related to the procedural bylaw. The policy now has evolved beyond that. So the one question I have is, now what do we take back to the procedural bylaw as a direction? How are these two documents going to be interrelated now?
Mr. Coates?
Thank you, Worship, and thank you for the question. Because I must confess that in my career, I've not seen this process utilized to manage correspondence and to have a guideline as a product of a council procedures bylaw. To me, they're to a different way of looking at this, they're distinct from each other, and they might interface on certain aspects, especially when we talk about council agendas and correspondence that's being placed on a council agenda. But my understanding and my experience with how these are managed is they're distinct from that, and they do deal with all of these array of circumstances. But I would like to clarify that the non-read portion of this third attachment is existing from the guidelines, and there hasn't been changes made unless they're struck through. So the evolution of that I'm not familiar with, and perhaps Councillor Patterson might be talking about the discussions that led to that, because I know she was part of those, and I certainly wasn't, and nor was Ms. Williams. We haven't added to this other than what's in red, and that was again for these pieces related to the agenda and trying to enhance some transparency around publishing and that sort of thing.
Thank you, Mr. Coates. Councillor Patterson? Your microphone.
just to clarify that, that was actually, I took that from the original document of when we had all the information of that. There were a number of guidelines that were attached to the council procedural bylaw that to me made up the, part of what was in the package. The other question I would just want to ask about is, let me see, 3.5. And that says all correspondence is deemed as in the custody and control of the district and is subject to FOIPA. I think what is really important here and what isn't talked about too much in here is certainly as elected officials, I think there's a certain level of trust that members of the community have in their ability to communicate with us and not have everything filed formally unless it is business. And I must admit, I'm very glad now that most of my conversations are exactly that, conversations with the public and not letter writing. But I think as elected officials, the most important thing to understand also in this is that even by providing the records, submitting them to the district office here, municipal office, it does not in any way alleviate our responsibilities for business if we are asked under freedom of information to submit records. So that would mean kind of keeping them in both places, sending one to the hall, keeping them, and also retaining them in whatever devices we do our municipal business on. And that hasn't really been clearly articulated in the policy, and perhaps for most of us that went through the FOIPA training in the first councillor's term, I'm not sure what training has been available to new councillors. But still, I mean, I take most of my guidance from what I understand to be my duty to continue to keep in my records, because I could, if it was council business, be required to submit them under a freedom of information request.
Mr. Coates?
Your Worship, let me just say this, that when a record is created and it's about the business of the municipality and it's done on that premise, as opposed to perhaps a communication you might have on a personal level, that's accessible under the legislation, and so it's not at all uncommon in other local governments. I mean, it can happen here as well that council members' email inboxes are asked to be searched for records. I've seen information access requests come for all of the correspondence in Councillor X's inbox. I'm not sure what the purpose of that is, but nevertheless, that's there. And so because we provide you that email inbox, there's a custodial responsibility for it. Is it better to divest and have them filed? Because, and this is the most difficult part that email has created out of this, because we've got records all over the place. And so we know that our central files, even our electronic files, are never going to be fully up to date with emails. And so you're quite right in that there's a retention piece there, because the correspondence isn't a transitory record. It's something that has some sustainability to it and expected retention. So, and it's not a perfect world when it comes to electronic record keeping in Outlook or another such platform.
Anything else, Councillor Patterson?
Yeah, no, and so just as a follow-up to that, there may be perhaps consideration to add a bit of strengthening to that, to just as a guidance to council members that that this does not alleviate them from any of the responsibility under FOIPA to retain records.
Ms. Williams, you wanted to add something?
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm just going to pull on my old hat from many years ago. So if I'm hearing Councillor Patterson correct, she's expressing that there is a requirement for council members, a responsibility for council members to retain those emails in their email server, even though she's provided them to the district. And I just want to clarify that that's not a requirement. And it's actually not considered best practice because now you've got duplicate records, and it creates multiple records that staff have to go through when they do get an FOI request that may be duplicates. So once you've transferred it to the municipality as the custodian, please feel free to delete that from your email server.
Thank you for that clarification. Councillor Patterson?
Thank you for that clarification, because that's not explicit in anything here. And so maybe that needs to be clarified in the policy.
Okay, I've had comments and questions from everybody. I think I have a suggestion here of a process to move this forward, because I don't think we're ready to approve this as is based on the conversation that we've had here. My suggestion is going to be, we have a motion to receive, just to report it as is. I think we should have a motion to amend the guidelines to include sections 2.2 and 2.3 so that those are actually enacted. Those are the things that just state that a correspondence is accepted up to 2 p.m. and that correspondence after that will come. So if anybody reads our guidelines as they exist now, they can, at least that clarification is given to staff. I think that is an important operational kind of fix. And then I think some sort of motion that this, that the policy be referred back to staff to be reformed, with reflecting some of the conversation here. And I've made some notes here, I think, but I don't think we have to include them all in a motion. I think we can probably just keep it a bit more general to kind of move us through this piece. So that's, oh yes, we need to have public input. And there's nobody online, so I'm assuming nobody's put up their hand. Any members of the public wish to address us on this matter of public correspondence? I don't see any hands popping up. I'll certainly take a motion to receive first. Moved and seconded, thank you. Any discussion, all those in favor? Any opposed, none opposed, thank you. So my recommendation here is that we do have a motion to amend the existing guidelines to include the recommended 2.32 and 2.33, which are the correspondence should be published on the agenda and the matter, et cetera, at 2 p.m. Those pieces, I think those are important procedural pieces for clarification. Councillor Green?
I see this as an operational document. I don't see it as a policy document. That's my struggle at the moment. This is more operational than it is policy. So that, keeping that in mind, I'm hoping that the amendments and revisions review could simplify it. But essentially, it's operational in my humble view.
So I don't entirely disagree with you. I'm sorry, and these are just my suggestions, so I'll take this from council. I think we have a policy, the guidelines right now, it's not a policy. So my recommendation, we amend the guidelines which exist, just to make that one change, so staff have the clarity of procedure when it comes to those correspondence coming into council meetings. And then we would deal with the issue of the policy to refer it back, so that as a document, we can consider some of the input that was taken here and come back with a different document.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Appleton, I think he's trying to type something up to that effect. I think I might just do this in two separate motions, Mr. Coates, just for clarification, so we don't muddy so I think sections 2.2 should be added to the existing guidelines. It's just one motion, or zoom in a bit.
Yeah, just make it, yeah. Oh, that's way better.
Hey, old eyes are here. So I think this would be the very simple motion that sections 2.32 and 2.33 be added to existing guidelines. So this is just, Councillor Appleton moved and seconded. Clear to everybody, any discussion? Okay, then all those in favor, any opposed, none opposed. The second motion I think will be a little bit more carefully worded, but I think draft policy, yeah, I think that's probably effective. And I think if there's a motion, if that's moved, then I'll make a couple of comments just so we can give some guidelines. Moved and seconded. My observation here, and I'll keep it brief. I think Councillor Green's comments about the high level pieces of this are worthwhile thinking about. I think just defining what our correspondence guidelines or policy is intended to do, and being very clear about what is sort of the business of the district and what is not the business of the district, and where that's the responsibility of the district to hold the record and where it's the responsibility of the councillor to hold the record. those are sort of the big high-level pieces that should guide behavior. And I think some of the specifics then will fall out of those two pieces. But I think what I'm hearing here today is that people reading through this saw a lot of shall or shall not language that was out of a context of what the gray areas would encompass. And so I think, appreciate this is now a significant amount more work than just refining what is there. But I think we can keep the existing policy in place and bring back guidelines in future to kind of have this better document. It's a public-facing document that might have a flow chart and those other things that come part of it. So there's not a lot of specificity to this, but I know that a lot of notes have been taken. And I think if anybody's taken additional notes, we can share those with staff as well. But I know I've got mine here from things that I've heard. Councillor Smart.
And I appreciate just, gathering the comments that have taken place already. And I guess the one thing that hasn't been touched on is having touch points and revisiting, just how much I appreciated the conversation today. And I would love to see us touch on this perhaps even yearly, just to have a check-in of what's working well and what could be better. And I wonder if that could be part of the guidelines, that kind of process. And I realize that's perhaps more attached to a policy traditionally, but I just put that out there as far as I would love to continue this conversation each year.
I think when that policy comes back, that's something that we might want to do is just have a little, maybe not a sunset clause, but also a motion that comes back within a year or two to review how it's working and make changes at that time. That's not an unreasonable ask. But that would probably come at the time that the policy came back. All right, that's a good suggestion. Anything else, Councillor Smart?
I also didn't want to lose track of the suggestion of a flow chart because I really think that would be helpful for communication to the public and for understanding at this table.
Notice that Mr. Coates gave the old-fashioned version of the thumbs up emoji. Apparently is a thumbs up. So the motion for Councillor Watson.
Yes, just to the, I guess, the motion that's before us, it's just a point of clarification. We're talking about draft policy, and I wasn't clear that that is actually the direction we necessarily thought we were going. I've heard amend the guidelines, which we have already agreed to. Are we suggesting that we want to consider the guidelines rewritten as policy? I'm not clear.
I'll turn to Mr. Coates on this one. I think the intention here was to make sure that there was some council-approved substance to this at the end of the day, which has not really happened. So what would come back would have the stamp of approval from council. Whether we call it a policy or guideline at that point, I guess, is a bit up in the air. But I think generally those would be policies that are council-led. But Mr. Coates will take your comments on that.
Thank you, Your Worship. And I would concur with your summation of that what's important is the content and the packaging less so. And I obviously won't be the person bringing it back for you, but nonetheless, there's a tremendous amount of information and it's all video recorded. So it should be easy enough to pull that together. And there can be options for council when it comes back is here's what it looks like as a guideline. Here's what it looks like as a policy.
I will point out you've got about 3 weeks of work that you could probably squeeze this into if you wanted to really work hard at it. Very great finishing flourish there at your career. Okay. Okay. I have a motion on the floor. Is there any other discussion on this? Don't see it. So I'm ready to call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. Anything else arising from this suggestions before we move on? No. Thank you, everybody. I thought that was you can tell everybody read through this in great detail and thought about it a lot to see how it actually impacts the day-to-day life. We'll hopefully move through the next items a little bit faster than those ones. 7.4, also open for public comment. Please raise your hand now because I don't think this is going to last very long. We have a regular council and committee of the whole meeting schedule. Mr. Coates, I think the title says it all, but I'll let you give a quick introduction.
I don't like to make promises, but I have a strong suspicion this will be a lot quicker. And so just there's a requirement every year that the district, all municipalities rather, publish their council meeting schedule. And so convention means that we bring that forward for council to consider. Your procedure bylaw specifies when your meetings are held and when they're not held. And despite all of that, the standard practice is to bring that back for council to endorse before publishing it, which we would do later this year to make sure that we've met our obligations to do that. Just to point out to you that the only two nuances to your normal schedule that are prescribed specifically in the procedure bylaw are the committee of the whole meetings. There's two of them that are shown with an asterisk because they fall on a Tuesday, because the Monday's a holiday. Our bylaw does not automatically default committee of the whole meetings to the day after the statutory holiday. And so for your consideration is the schedule that includes those two meetings added on the Tuesday, because there's two of this committee of whole meetings that are impacted. Otherwise, it is standard fare from your procedure bylaw.
Great.
Move receipt.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Any opposed? Not opposed? Before I take any motion, I'm just going to check again if there's anybody from the public who wishes to address council. Seeing none, go ahead.
Move the recommendation as laid out by staff.
Moved and seconded. Thank you. Any discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. Your prediction was correct, Mr. Coates. That did go faster than the last item on the agenda. The next two are not subject to public input. 8.1 is we've had first three readings of bylaw 4832, so this would be for adoption. I will take the motion on the floor, then we can have a
I'll
discussion.
move that council adopt bylaw number 4832, Monterey Avenue, stopping up, closing, and removing of highway dedication bylaw 2023.
Moved and seconded. Thank you. Is there any discussion on this? Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Mayor. The bylaw reads to stop up, it reads that the road will be stopped up and closed to traffic of all kinds. For clarification, does that mean closed to traffic of all kinds through traffic or closed to public traffic to the site in general?
Thank you. We have Mr. Robertson on the line here. Is that who actually would direct that question to? I believe so. Mr. Robertson, if you're, did you hear the question? We can have it repeated if you wish. I think Mr. Robertson may have stepped away from his screen for a moment. Mr. Coates?
Your Worship, I can perhaps help with this one. And so the process is twofold to sort of ultimately decommission a dedicated road. So this is a dedicated roadway, and there's two processes that can take place, but as long as it remains a dedicated road, the only way to sort of chip away at that is to stop it up and close it to traffic by bylaw first, and then oftentimes a local government will abandon that highway, and it can then be consolidated into another parcel of land or stand on its own depending on what it looks like. So this is sort of step one in the process around how to disable that from becoming a public roadway in the future, as distinct from a parking lot or some other opportunity to be driven upon.
Great. Thanks for that clarification. Councillor Patterson?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. I think that answers my question. As part of the 2023 financial plan, the public safety building feasibility assessment was planned. Wondering, has that been done, and is there any site plan attached to that?
Thank you. Ms. I don't know if we don't have any, I'll give it to Ms. Williams, who's overseer of all things.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Councillor Patterson and the rest of council. Yes, there is a feasibility study in place for the public safety building in the 2023 work plan and financial plan. It got bumped out a little bit this year because of the Carnarvon Park RFP, but it is getting underway fairly soon, so that we should see that before the end of the year and have a public consultation on that.
Councillor Patterson?
Thank you. And one last comment. The proposed bylaw consolidates the land presently used for public and district facilities into a single lot that will be used as a construction and operations site. Construction and operations activities are not compatible necessarily with playgrounds and public facilities, and some of the changes in use has already occurred. And so with passing then of this, and in general, I do support this. What would the next steps be if this is adopted by council? And I anticipate it will be. In fact, moving ahead with this as a development construction site.
Mr. Coates?
Your Worship, I'm not sure if Mr. Robertson has joined, because I noticed that his presence might look a little different on the screen here, but I can start anyway. But so I thought I heard Councillor Patterson suggest that the adoption of the bylaw would consolidate the parcels, but I don't, this is step one, which would be to stop up and close that piece of road to traffic. I think the long-term intent for that property, because it's, I believe, some 20 titles, is to ultimately consolidate all of the parcels. So there's another step, as I recall, these processes to actually abandon that highway and ultimately sort of undedicate it, and then it becomes a fee simple piece of land that could be attached to an adjoining property. So I'm not sure if I heard Councillor Patterson properly on that, but I wanted to address that piece. And so the next step would be to ultimately abandon it. But I don't have the time frame for that. And I'm not sure if Mr. Robertson can add anything to that.
Thank you. So a number of steps to go. Councillor Patterson?
Thank you very much for that clarification. I think with that, then I'm satisfied. I would still like the answers to the other questions because the operational use of the site has already changed, and those changes are evolving, and so I think it is important that we get to next steps, but we are at this time very close now to getting to council's priorities, so I don't see much use in referring this to priorities since they're coming up so quickly anyways. I don't think I'm going to forget in the interim. So with those clarifications, then I will support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other discussion on them? So a motion to adopt on the floor. Seeing no other discussion, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. Move us on to 8.2, Upland Siting and Design for 3255 Uplands Roads. Mr. Muller, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Council. The district has received an application for upland siting and design permit for the property located at 3255 Uplands Road to allow for the construction of a single-story addition at the front of the home, connecting the front-facing dormers to create one single dormer, expansion of the rear deck, and exterior upgrades to the front and back facade, upgrades to selected doors and windows, and construction of a rear patio and outdoor kitchen. A review of the building site and plans, building plans and site plans, and other supporting documents was conducted, and it's the opinion of the staff that the application comprises a significant investment in the exterior aesthetic of the home, and that it generally considered appropriate, compatible design with the respects that respects the upland setting and adheres to the upland design guidelines. The advisory design panel reviewed this proposal in September 20th meeting, at their September 20th meeting, and passed a resolution in support of the upland siting design permit.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muller. Are there any questions of staff on this item? Go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite.
Just one question. I noticed that the percentage of hard surface in the front of the house is above the 25% allowable at 28.1%, but it says it's existing non-conforming. And so if they chose to add more hard surface in the front, they would have to come back to council for a variance, correct? And they don't need to, because someone asked me this, they don't need to get a variance because it's existing non-conforming right now, correct?
Mr. Muller?
Yes, that's correct. We did a check on the plans, and there's no additions to the hard surfacing.
Great, thank you very much. Any other questions, discussion? Go ahead, Councillor Green. Okay, we have a motion to receive first. Moved, seconded, thank you. All those in favor? Any opposed, not opposed? And then you're moving the recommendation to authorize the piece, yeah, okay. Thank you, moved and seconded. Sorry, approve, I should use the words authorize. Any discussion? Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I also noticed on this that the tree canopy on this lot is 27% compared to the 45% that it would normally be. Is that just normally occurring on this lot? And was there any discussion about adding to the tree canopy?
Mr. Muller?
Yes, it was part of the requirement of the tree permit that the applicant bring the tree canopy coverage up to the 45% requirement, I believe. Yeah, and so that will be in the Parks memo that's attached to the report.
Thank you very much. Don't see other discussions. I'll call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. We have one more item on the agenda. This is open for public input, although again, not a large number of people online. But if anybody wishes to address council on this matter, please dial into the 1855 number and hit *9 to raise your hand, or come in through the Zoom meeting. Please do that now, because I don't know how long this item will be in front of us, and I want to make sure that we're not unduly waiting, so just indicate now. With that, I will hand this over to Mr. Boole to provide an overview of the request here to amend the covenant.
Thank you, Mayor. This application has been in front of you recently, and some decisions were made in September, I believe. A couple of changes have been approved for the covenant, and this is a restrictive covenant on a property on the corner of St. Patrick and Central Avenue. Dates back 20 years ago to pinpoint what kind of use would be allowed. And today, one of the elements of the requested change from September, which was not explicitly decided on, but in September, it's the applicant has given it some further thought and requested staff to bring that particular topic back for further consideration by council, and it relates to the use of the use limitations in the covenant. The request is to, as approved in September, the restaurant use was added, but the applicant is requesting if that could be widened to extend to a general reference to retail use and service business use, which are two definitions in the C2 zoning that applies to this site. So it would be a further widening of that of the allowable uses, but within the scope of those definitions. The applicant is here as well to provide any additional comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I might just invite the applicant forward. You're both welcome to come forward if you wish. I think this kind of boils down to the rationale. As noted, this was discussed at the last meeting, and I think the general direction at that time was to amend the covenant as requested, but leave the zoning question alone. So I think there's probably going to be some questions here about the rationale for why outside of the letter. Are there questions from members of council to the applicant or to staff on this matter? Go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite.
It would be exactly as you've just stated, like why, I'm kind of a little bit confused because I thought we already approved the changes to the covenant, so I'm really wondering why this has come back to us at all, so.
Hardcastle, there you go. Yes, so this is the ask here is essentially to expand the potential uses outside of the ones that are explicitly listed in the covenant. Perhaps you can just give some rationale for that change.
Certainly. Peter Hardcastle, on behalf of Hillel Architecture and the owners of 713 St. Patrick. The owners were very appreciative of the conversation that was had and the granting of the permission of restaurant use on September 11th, being formally added to the property, and it was a restrictive covenant that was removed. There has been a great deal of interest in the property from restaurateurs to use this building in that location. It is our personal opinion that that's a very good use for this building. It's excellent for the neighborhood, excellent for the building. Over the life of the building, however, our economy will change, business interests will come and go in this location, or at the moment, we're witnessing restaurateurs financing new restaurants as being ones filled with concern. So all these negotiations are ongoing. It does bring up the question that the second half of that evening, which was the broadening of a very restrictive covenant and bringing forward an amendment to the covenant that would express retail use and service business use as per the C2 commercial zone as it's currently written. And one of the things that was expressed that night is if we broaden the discussion of what businesses could be there, and one of the expressions that came out that night is then what is the discussion about what we don't want to permit there. The planning department has reviewed the bylaws, and those businesses permitted in the C2 zone, businesses that are not helpful or would bring harm to a community. Oak Bay now has sufficient other bylaws in place so that this generic statement of retail use and service business use as per C2 commercial use zone is now supported by the planning department, but perhaps 20 years ago, you did not have a bylaw about the use of cannabis. You may not have had a bylaw about a few other things. So this is just to broaden the use of the building to bring it up to full compliance with the C2 zone, knowing now that there are other bylaws protecting you from businesses that might be harmful to the community. For the owners of 713 St. Patrick is to make sure we have this building for the full life of the building. It's got the most opportunities to secure a tenant for it, and to make this a dynamic business corner. It's consistent with the community development policies on making sure these little nodes of businesses are encouraged. It gives us resilience in the community. For the owners, the 3 specific businesses that were in that portion of the covenant have each tried to exist on that location. Each of them has failed. But there are other businesses within the general description of retail use and service business use that might, in our contemporary world, find a home there. We just want to make sure we have the most opportunities for success on this corner, and the success in one business corner broadens the potential success for all the other corners at this intersection. That's all.
Thank you for the answer. Councillor Braithwaite?
Well, I have a comment, but I mean, I guess I'll wait for other questions first.
All right, thank you. Is there questions of staff or the applicant? Go ahead, Councillor Green.
Through you to the applicant, do you have a business or other businesses in mind then beyond the restaurant? I would think you might have something in mind. Would that be fair to say? Or it would just be helpful to know what examples you're thinking of in terms of specifics. Thank you.
Mr. Hardcastle?
We only wanted to express in the covenant that we had a broader business base. Our current negotiations are with restaurateurs who want to secure this location for a restaurant use. That's a very nervous business community at the moment. And what if those negotiations aren't successful? What if there isn't a restaurateur? We still want to make sure that if those parties are not willing to finance, and you must understand, financing a new commercial kitchen is an incredibly expensive item to do. But should they not follow through and sign a lease and invest in this property in that manner, we don't want to make sure that what remains on the books is something that is restricting the use of this building to currently retail, which is accepted, but beauty parlor, beauty salon, hair cutting. This is a very limited description when, if we had a more broader description, completely consistent with the definition of retail use and business service use, just like all other locations of C2, if not today, over the life of the building. Our discussion previously did revolve mostly around the definition of restaurant. I think that was all of our enthusiasm that night, that we had a business owner that wanted to go forth and secure the building. We all walked away pleased knowing that was possible. We hope parties are similarly interested, and there are other restaurateurs interested. It's a difficult time for the restaurant industry. So what if nobody signs those leases? It's what we get left with. We thought while we're entertaining this discussion about the covenant, we should think about the 50 to 80 year lifespan of the building, have the one discussion now, just to make sure that we have the greatest potential of success for this location.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Appleton?
Thank you, Your Worship. And just confirming with staff and possibly a question to the applicant. Another permitted use under the C2 zoning is financial institution use. And as members of the public and council are aware, financial institutions have been limited, or steps have been taken to sort of restrict and deliberately locate financial institutions especially in our village centers, in order to maintain availability of retail of those ground floor spaces for community amenities. So I guess I would have a moderate concern about everybody needs a financial institution. I think we're fairly well supplied with financial institutions and those types of spaces in Oak Bay. But I would have some concerns about, say a financial planning organization or something like that setting up shop in this specific location. And given the fact that I think, at least from my perspective, the main intent for that space was to provide a community sort of food, beverage, amenity feature to that. So I think financial institution, while valuable in the broader sense, probably isn't, in my view, the right usage for this particular lot. So I'm just wondering, from the applicant's perspective, would an amendment to, to permit C2 zone, to allow the uses otherwise permitted under C2 zoning, but is specifically excluding the financial services component, would they be amenable to that?
Mr. Hartcastle? Oh,
And yes, it was specifically mentioned in the planner's report that there was an exception to the definition, which both included the financial institution and liquor retail. And you have other bylaws within Oak Bay, such as the control of cannabis sales, which would automatically apply as well.
so as Mr. Bull, to confirm, the C2 zoning would not allow for financial institutions or straight liquor sales, is that correct?
Through you, Your Worship, it's a bit more complex than that. So, but the proposal does not extend to financial institutional use. That's the short answer. And that is because the C2 zone that does apply to this site, it lists a couple of different uses. And I'll list them off quickly. There's 4 or 5. Retail use, service business use, restaurant use, financial institution use, so mentioned separately, and then liquor retail use, but only on a certain parcel. The request is to only allow for the categories retail use and service business use. And the service business use definition excludes financial institutional use. So this request does not extend to the full uses of C2, but only to those first 2 categories of retail use and service business use. And within the definitions of the zoning bylaw, that means that the financial institutional use would not be allowed if this particular request is granted. And Mr. Hill is also referring to cannabis, for example. That's a general ban, prohibited use in our zoning bylaw. So that's the nuance here. So this is one step up from the restaurant use that was approved in September, but it still does not extend to the full scope of all uses in C2. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask a question and follow up with that? We do have zoning like C4, C5, which is local commercial and neighborhood deli use. We have C1, which is local commercial use. Are those types of zoning not deemed to be appropriate? Because they would seem to be encompassing the intention of these sort of local commercial models. I appreciate that would require a rezoning because it's currently zoned to C2. It was rezoned from C1 to C2 at some point in the past to allow Casey's to exist under that model. But I'm just curious as to why the C2. I guess it's just because it's existing C2. Is that the rationale, or? I'll go to Mr. Bull on that one.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I was looking at the zoning map earlier today and noticing there is a C4 or C5 zone property close by, but this particular site happens to have current zoning C2, so that's why the covenant amendment has been catered or set up to work with that zoning. Thank you.
Councillor Braithwaite for a second time.
Thank you. So, I mean, going along the lines of the financial institution, I think that there's a lot of concern also with real estate agencies as well, that we wouldn't want to see a real estate agency there. So I'm feeling uncomfortable with making changes to something that we had a very robust discussion about the last time you were here. And I wonder why we would not just stay with the way we have, with the decision that we made the last time you were here. And then if there is a change that you want in the future, then you would come back and ask for that change then. That just seems to be a smarter thing I'm more comfortable doing that, is keeping with our original decision. And then if there's something in the future that you wanted to come back and ask for, then we can deal with that then. That's just how I'm feeling right now.
Sure, and I'm going to turn that into a question for the applicant, which is just the process that was undertaken with the covenant change. I mean, the covenant change is not an unusual situation to have. Is that deemed, just curious why you would see that as being an overly complicated mechanism? If we've got sort of a fairly broad use of uses that encompass retail and restaurant and deli uses, if there was a specific use request that could come back, is that time frame asked just too long, or what's the? I'll leave it to you in terms of sort of articulating the. Do you wish to come forward? It might as well just. Just state your name for the record and.
Yeah, Anoop Graywall, one of the owners at 713 St. Patrick. I don't think that we're trying to find a specific tenant. It's just that there will be times where changes will happen, especially with the economy. We are in talks with some restaurants, and unfortunately, finding the right path is still in discussion. So to give us a broader look.
And another point is, we can't even advertise the property available for specific use unless the use is available on the property. So requesting the amendment to retail use and service business use, with the exceptions, of course, of financial institution and liquor retail, just means that it can be advertised for all those other uses. No businesses are going to come forward to seek out leasing a space if it's not permitted that their business could be there. We won't get those interested parties. It is exceptionally restrictive the way it is written.
I understand the dilemma here. We're struggling a little bit as well. The report here does not include the revised covenant that was approved at the last meeting. It's got the old covenant and then with the report just citing the changes to it. So it's a bit difficult to kind of, so can you just, Mr. Bowl, you probably have it there. What are the allowances currently under the covenant?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I'm just checking the report from September. Gotta grab the right one. So what was approved in September was to add a new 2D delta, use as a restaurant as permitted by zoning, license for the provision
So
of
can
food.
you just read the A, B, and C of what's allowed uses?
A, B, and C. All right. So the other uses, A is the retail sale and storage of groceries, meat, fish, bakery goods, and sundry household and garden items. B is the self-serve consumption of bakery goods, deli items, or beverages which have been prepared on the premises. C is a barbershop, hairdresser shop, or beauty salon. And then D was added as the restaurant use.
Okay, thank you. And I guess, so in terms of other viable entities that could be on that space and add vitality to the corner, I can think of a lot of things that wouldn't add vitality. I think we heard, real estate agents, lawyers' offices, UPS delivery store, you name it. There's so many in that list of C2 that would fundamentally harm that corner. I guess is probably the concern we have here. It might be helpful if there are other aspects that we could add to the covenant that would be a bit more inclusive, that would not take away from the vibrancy of that corner. And I think it's important to recognize here and I do really appreciate, Mr. Grable, that you're here. I know there's a lot of, you've owned that property for a long time. You've been very careful about stewarding the existence of Casey's through that. And I know that you're very aware of the emotional attachment that corner has to a lot of people in the community. And so I do want to express my appreciation for that. I know the intention here is to maintain that, but I think there's going to be some concern here about if we just say C2, future owners of the building, future other pieces, could ensconce a business that might be profitable to the building, but not beneficial to the community. And a lot of the the ease with which this passed was the recognition that this was going to continue the positive aspects of this building on the corner. So it might be easier for us to sort of add things that you think would be viable in broad terms to a covenant than it might be to sort of refer it back to a C2, which is very hard to anticipate 20 or 30 years down the road, things that might go in there that would be not suitable to the site. I guess is probably the struggle that we're having here, is the more positive versus negative approach to the language.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's just at this point, when you're trying to market the space to somebody, it is very hard to go with just the limitation that we have right now. This was just more to kind of give it a bit of a broader net to kind of open up the door, for interested parties to say, okay, well, yes, this does, support your business, or because it has been very restrictive in the past, and we do appreciate your the restaurant use that came about 2 months ago, but it is a very difficult climate for new restaurants, and I mean that might change, but when you're in the planning stages of the building, you have to kind of widen the net a little bit to search for tenants.
We certainly appreciate that piece of it. And I think what I've heard from the table here is a lot of support for innovative things that would come from that if they're outside that box a little bit, but still meet the community needs that be there. But difficult to sort of give a broad net that we don't have any control over that in the future, given the C2 was never intended for sort of a corner commercial space. I'm going to go to Councillor Green. Go ahead, and then Councillor Appleton, and then Councillor Patterson, and then Councillor.
Thank you. I wasn't on council at the time, but if anyone can remember, how was the commercial space handled for the Bowker, which is also a corner property in a largely residential area, on the fringe certainly of a neighborhood? But I just wondered how that was handled, because that was one of the first developments that had commercial activity below. So I just wondered if there are any precedents or examples.
Yeah, that had a covenant attached to it that the corner unit had to be a cafe or restaurant. The other retail sections were not constrained. I think Councillor Appleton and Patterson and Braithwaite.
No, thank you, Your Worship, and and I appreciate the comments, and I do concur with your comments to the applicant, just with respect to what types of things we would seek to entertain, and I do hear the concurrence about what I guess I would just make the point that council over time has recognized the existence of sort of the C4 and the C5 zoning reflects the significance and kind of like the individuality of these small sites located right in neighborhoods, and the fact that you have the C4 and the C5 zoning with very specific types of uses provided sort of underlines why the intent for those types of sites that are located in residential neighborhoods. So even though those two types of zoning, we're not going to seek to rezone, obviously, but I think that the intention of what was laid out kind of in C4 and C5 zoning sort of also applies to a certain extent here. So I would concur that there are additional options for the site beyond the straight restaurant, which has already been provided for, that I think council might be interested in entertaining. But with that same intention from the C4 and C5 zoning of providing a neighborhood type amenity type of thing. So I certainly acknowledge that there may be a challenge on the applicants, from the applicant's perspective, to define that list, and I can appreciate that that's a challenge. I guess I would say from my perspective as one councillor, that effort I think would be worthwhile, and I think would likely meet with approval. Thank you.
Councillor Appleton, with Councillor Patterson and Braithwaite.
Yes, thank you. So just then for clarity, the intent in doing this would be for the marketing purposes. So in other words, you could turn it over to a leasing agent, a third-party leasing agent, not doing it yourself, with the broader specification of the C2, and it would be advertised C2 with some restrictions as to use. Is that in a nutshell? Okay, thanks.
Councillor Braithwaite?
Just going to reiterate that I think, yes, if you come back to us with a list, that makes it more palatable to me. So that's how I would like to see the direction go for this.
Thank you. Just for my clarification, that language of an agency C2 with some restrictions would exist now, but the restrictions are fairly specific in terms of what's possible there, as opposed to the opposite mechanism. I'm going to hand it back to the applicants here. I'm hearing from the table here a little bit of more comfort of having language in the covenant that explicitly adds pieces that you might be willing to see in there. That being said, I'll turn to the table here if there's any what the body wishes to do. But before I get to motions, I also want to make sure that we have, again, opportunities for any members of the public who may be watching to speak up at this point. It's not that late. Come on. Must be somebody around. Okay. Not seeing any members of the public.
Move
Back to the
receipt.
table. Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed?
And then we just leave it now?
Well, I think I might just go back. I appreciate maybe to Mr. Hardcastle, Mr. Graywall on this one. Is there anything that you should have wished to add at this point? Then I'll turn to our council to give some direction for next steps. I know you've got your own drivers here for challenges and so forth, so. And we do want to be supportive. I really do. We just all want this to be a very successful corner. And I'm just going to say for the record, if anybody is watching, this would be an amazing place for a restaurant. Like it would have so much love. It would be full every single night they wanted to open. So the right restaurant in the right place, holy cow, is just a fantastic opportunity. So if anybody watching, please pay attention.
Just wanted to let you know that, yes, we are very patient to find somebody that will actually open up some place that's going to be very community oriented. So I know that doesn't leave an answer that you can walk away with, but the reality of it will be is the current economic times will determine, what that place will look like, what type of a restaurant. There are interested parties. It's just that we're trying to find ways for them to make it happen. But in the meantime,
Yes, I don't think there's anything that I could add. I would want fairness to be exercised here, so if another business location has the definition of C2 retail and business uses, that same opportunity would be extended here. That's just fairness. The specific businesses that were listed here, those 3 specific businesses have existed in this location. They have failed. There's a limited amount of foot traffic, and what we all want is a dynamic, engaging business, a specialty food supplier, a restaurant, all of those that we wish to come forward with. I don't know if we can put together a list of business types or a description of a business that would give us all confidence that only those businesses would do well here. We could attempt to do so. We all want essentially the same thing. Perhaps we're all trying to find a way of putting that in words so that you would have confidence in approving something and we would have confidence that we could advertise it. We could only advertise it for that purpose after its approval. We would have no choice then to come up with the wording for you in advance.
I'm going to just ask one question. I'll go to you, Councillor Watson. The wording that we currently have in terms of retail use, is that language itself too restrictive in terms of allowing for innovation and options for retail use? Because that can be a pretty broad term, broadly interpreted. Is that something that we should be addressing within the covenant itself or within the bylaw, like the zoning itself, to define retail use in a way that's more flexible? I'm just curious if that's an issue that you're bumping up against.
No, I believe retail is currently permitted and as stated that we couldn't make it any more broad than that.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Watson?
Yes, just a question to the applicant, sort of, if I could, following up on Councillor Patterson's question. Do you feel why do you, sorry, maybe better to state it. If you reach out right now in a more open-ended way, could you attract interest even based on our discussion that says clearly we don't want financial institutions? Can you be more prospective in your outreach? Because what I'm hearing here is that if you came back with something that sang to the community, we could implement that pretty quickly if you had some suggestions. What I heard Mr. Hardcastle say is he felt that he couldn't even go out and ask people to kind of put bids in or express interest unless we'd already put it in the covenant. But I just want to query that assumption.
To the applicants, Mr. Graywall?
Yeah. The harder part about the third-party marketing is that they have to be very careful on how they present the listing for lease. And, you know, we can go down a bit of a path with them and then find out that that particular type of business is not allowed. And then, you know, there's lost time and more than anything is just time. You lose time. As far as restaurants, cafes, coffee, we know that those exist. We are pursuing them. It is actually listed out there in a public format through a third-party listing agent, and there is, like I said, some interest, but it is it's not concrete. And so with that, the business service use / retail use request was they came up from the listing agents to give us a little bit more of a wider net to see who we can prospect.
Okay, thank you for that. Those are my speakers list. Councillor Patterson?
Yes, just a follow-up question to that. Is the C2 designation here a restrictive factor on prospective leasing because having a C2 is, in fact, some assurance if a business fails that they can sublet the space as a C2 business type. Is that where the marketplace is right now?
Mr. Graywall?
I can probably answer that more. And you guys are probably more familiar with during the pandemic. There was a lot of business closure. With the tenants I had in there, you know, my goal with them was this business will carry on as long as I'm the landlord. So we did everything possible without any level of government help to make sure that that tenancy survived the pandemic. So from an owner's perspective, you know, I want to see a tenant in there that's going to last, a strong tenant that's going to last and make, you know, build the community. Like we have lots of nice, you know, eateries in Oak Bay, and I think everybody wants a fresh new one in there, just as an option. But that comes with a bit of a price when you're doing new construction. And like Peter mentioned, ventilations to kitchens are not exactly the cheapest things to do in this market. So that kind of led, like I said, from the listing agents to talk a little bit more of a broader net to see if there is a tendency out there other than just a restaurant if we don't see it coming. And from our perspective, we're building a very brand new building that the core mechanical work is being done as we speak, plumbing to electrical. You can only take it so far without not having the answers and who's going to be there. So there are some complications from that perspective, but that's an owner problem, not a council problem, right? But at the same time, the wider net does give us a little bit more option to reach out to other prospective tenants.
Thank you for that. I will just say that, well, it is an owner problem, not a council problem. It's still a council interest to see that succeed in that space, and we certainly want everything to go. Yeah. It's a good question. The question was just, do we need any kind of motion if we're going to not touch this and just seek a, I think if there's no motion at this table, I think my recommendation is to, if there's something specific you see there as opening the door a bit to something reasonable to bring it back as a change of covenant. I think you have a welcoming body here that wants to see something worthwhile. But I'll leave it if anybody does wish to make a motion here to amend this to include all the options within C2, then I'll give the opportunity here for that at this point. I don't think there's a motion to refer required at this point. I'll turn to staff. Is this something that's worth just referring back to you so that we're not, if we don't make a decision, sometimes it's hard to come back with a secondary ask within 6 months kind of thing. I don't want to put any kind of restriction on that. Is it better for us to have a motion to refer it back to staff to work with the applicant on options, or is it better to just leave it at this point and ask the applicant to come back if they can come up with some wording? This is different than
Yeah,
land
thank you,
uses.
Your Worship. I would suggest that a motion would be helpful. This is an application that has been made, has been looked at now by council 2 times. It would be good to know what the course of action is. I think beside receiving the report would be helpful to maybe record that you're recommending really to refer this back to staff and applicant to review other options, something to those effect. Thank
So
you.
probably to your question, Councillor Appleton, a motion to refer this back to staff to work with the applicant to see if there's, potential changes to the covenant that would meet their needs. Oh, you do? Okay, great. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Your Worship. So I would move that the application be referred back to staff to work with the applicant to define proposed additional uses for addition to the restrictive covenant in keeping with providing a neighborhood amenity.
Second. I'm going to just have that put up on screen. If you just read it again.
That the application be referred to staff to work with the applicant to define proposed additional uses for addition to the restrictive covenant. In keeping with providing a neighborhood amenity.
I'm going to get up on the screen and see if there's a seconder, and then if we want to make amendments, we can do it through that process. Refer back to staff to work with the applicant. Whoa. Making us all a little nauseous here, Mr. Coates. Yeah, we have to work on your spelling. And they just have to fix our Canadian spelling. It's just they try and give you an American spelling there, so it's the only problem with that one. So everybody can see the motion, and you seconded? Okay, so it's live on the floor. Councillor Green?
I'm being overwhelmed with policy tonight. How do you define a community amenity? Because I think this is it's a tough question, really, for anyone to define it. I mean, it's in the eye of the beholder in many respects. I just want to make sure we're not asking for the impossible. And do we have in our own minds as a community what an amenity looks like in a location like this? So it's just, it's just a general question, because I, like everyone else, want to see this, succeed. There's been a lot of excitement generated with this development. It's the first new rental housing in Oak Bay since 2012. So I want to be able to support it. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Graywell wanted to answer your question, so I'm going to give him the chance. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to just bring up one, sample, like from, just right from the get-go when the building started, there was lots of interest. We committed to the rental because we knew that the community needed it, and there was lots of reason to it not to be a rental building, but more a condo building. So I feel that we have put a lot of effort into a structure that only offers only 6 units, and you know what that means in this environment as far as construction goes. It's not very many. We did have, for example, a query from a daycare. Now, I don't know if that would be a community amenity, or does that benefit the community, or does it not? I see that as, okay, well, that's a great place for people to drop their children off, and it does help local families, and to me, that's an amenity. But we couldn't go forward with that person even, for 5 minutes because the zoning's not there. So if that was to come up, and say if it was on that list, hypothetically, I know you're not going to make a decision on something like that, but let's just say if it was, think about, is that an amenity, or is that a detriment to the location?
And Mr. Graywell, thank you for that example. I think the language here, it is a vague wording, but I think it's probably leavable as is if the mover is okay with it. Because really we're referring this back to staff to work with the applicants to come up with options. And I think that kind of example is a good one, and better to be dealt with at a policy level here than it is necessarily with a specific application necessarily coming in. So I think if those are some of those pieces that you may see as worthwhile, that we can consider those as part of the piece. So
Even the suggestion of the term amenity gives us something that we can actually place in advertising, in wording, in leasing agreements. So even that vocabulary being discussed tonight is helpful for us, making sure that people know that if there was a business coming forward that could be considered an amenity to the neighborhood, a contribution to the neighborhood, that we would welcome the discussions. And if this item has been deferred to staff, does that mean it's a little bit quicker and a little bit more responsive for us to bring that point to yourselves for consideration? In which case, then the decision tonight to leave it as an item deferred for further definition for staff. Maybe we can't ask for better when we're not here with something specific to request. But the word amenity is a good one, and everybody sort of nodded equally in acceptance. It's what's good for the neighborhood, what's a dynamic, engaging business that will benefit people in the neighborhood.
Okay, so the motion is moved and seconded. If you feel strongly about the language, then the term here is to vote against it. The motion is live there, just to refer this back to staff and to the applicants. Any other discussion? Go ahead, sorry, Councillor Smart.
Yes, just a clarification that we're not deferring this for staff decision-making, but we're deferring it to staff to come back to the council table with a proposal.
Correct. That's correct. So the process from this point on, there may be conversations and nothing happens. There may be something that the applicant says, no, we can define a couple of things that we think would be worthwhile, and they can work with staff to bring that back as proposed amendments to the covenant. But I think at this point, the direction is clear not to try and just amend it to C2 minus certain things, but to look at a covenant plus things, if that makes sense. Okay. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. Thank you very much. And with that, a motion to adjourn.
Move adjournment.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. Thank you.